Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report after 3 weeks. And as always, my timing is impeccable. I always choose the best time to take breaks and go on vacations and make myself indisposed for recording because nothing ever happens. And that's especially true of the past 20 days, and it's been since we have last aired an episode. But without further ado, I suppose we should get into all of the nothing that has happened in that time period.
Yes, lots of nothing. So I missed this on the last show, and then when you were on vacation, another incident happened, and I'm talking about the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. So the Ukrainians had a successful hit on a small missile ship called the Ivanovskaya, or the Ivanovsk. It's Ivan something, Ivanovsky, something like that. And anyways, it sunk. And then about 10 days later, there was a successful attack on a landing ship. So this isn't like it doesn't fire missiles, it doesn't have cannons. It looks something like, honestly, like a shipping vessel with maybe one 50 millimeter machine gun on it. That too got sunk. Um, I know some people were playing this down, but like, now I did see rescue efforts for the landing ship, but I didn't see anything for the Noviske. Now, like the Ivanovits. Now, the Ivanovits, I'm getting Ivaniske and Ivanovits mixed up. Ivaniske is the small village next to Bakhmut, which the Russians have a foothold in now. But all to say, like, those are sailors' lives, and like, maybe maybe the last four or five guys didn't make it, but it's a serious thing, and it's truly depressing to see this sort of thing still happening. Obviously, the attacks are being coordinated with the help of the British and the Americans, who are providing the info for um, the small. Well, they're relatively small. They're the size of a small rowboat. These are um, not well, they're kind of like FPV, but they're not flying. They're gliding across the water, so to speak, and they go at very slow distances, so they're at slow speeds, so they're not detected. Anyway, so I wanted to mention that. I guess I'll get some of the bad news out of the way. And part of it relates with the taking of Avdiivka, because Avdiivka fell on the 17th of February, but on the 13th of February, in a village or small town west of Avdiivka is another town called Selidove, and the Russians attacked Selidove. And even according to history legends, close to 300 Ukrainians were killed, and many believe that these were the Azov fighters, the so-called Third Brigade now. Um, the Russians launched some of their, I don't know if it was the tornadoes or not, but it's their stuff that's apparently comparable the um, to the HIMARS. So they obviously had good intel. They launched several rockets, at least three, and then they launched for another hour um, their version of what would you call them? The bombs that disperse many little bombs,
The cluster bombs?
the cluster bombs, and so they began then bombing there afterwards with cluster bombs. Now, I remember when this happened because Ukrainian Telegram was like with a lot of sad faces. They said there are rows and rows of ambulances streaming in. This is a horrible day. One guy said it's probably close to 200 men. However, there was a HIMARS strike in the Donetsk region by the Ukrainians, which happened at some kind of a training ground about 25, maybe 30 kilometers from the front line. and according to the Russians, 65 dead. Um, Now, there was another video that surfaced as well, and even South Front had a story on it, on the event that I'm talking about, the 65, and they said there were three strikes that happened in the Kherson region. Now, I saw them; the strikes did happen, and this is near the Dnieper River, where these three separate training areas were taking place. The thing is, though, is it was very sunny weather. Now, if you look at the vegetation, it is almost all coniferous trees. There are a group of deciduous trees that do not have any leaves. However, there is also a photo of deciduous trees with their leaves. And so I think this is probably something that happened maybe in the late summer, or it could have been in the spring. Um, some of the other bad news, well, we had that IL-76, not the one with the prisoners, but a little bit before that was shot and made it, landed. The crew was treated, and for a while there was a mystery about the A-50, um, and whether the Ukrainians had taken out an A-50. Now the Russians never mentioned anything about that until there was a loss of an Su-35, and then a day or two later, the loss of another A-50. Uh, Today has confirmed that the A-50 did go down, and it was in the Rostov region. Now, I the reason most people don't believe the Ukrainians shot it down is because the distance is too great for their air defense system. That includes the Patriots and the type of missiles that they have on board. And about a week later, it was confirmed that the Russians had shot down their own A-50. And in fact, the IL-76 and maybe even another A-50 that the Russians are mum about, but they were they did disclose that an IL-76 was damaged. That's the one where the crew survived. Was attacked. So I mean, this is really quite bad. Like for something like this to happen, because those crew members, they go through years of training. It's like 8 or 9 guys are dead. It's a big deal, and it's also not a good look. And but before we think like, this can't happen, this is something that only happens to the Russians. Well, I mean, the Ukrainians have done that as well, particularly at the beginning of the war, and then just Monday or Friday, we're recording on the Wednesday of February 28th. The Ukrainians knocked out one of their, I believe, Su-24. This is the one that can hold the Storm Shadow missiles. And then, of course, the Germans today knocked out an American Reaper drone. This is a week after the Houthis knocked out an American Reaper drone as well. So these things tend to happen. They're not
You
they're
know what?
not that unusual.
I have a tinfoil hat take on the Reaper drone situation.
Oh yeah.
It was revenge for Nord Stream.
Yes. I think that explains it. That's
It's
good
the
enough
only
for me.
explanation.
You nincompoop. That's how I imagine Schultz insults Biden.
That that
You'll
had
pay for
far
that, you nincompoop.
that had far too much spirit to it. It was not nearly sheepish enough, I suppose, is
Yeah,
the
you're
word I'm
right.
looking
You're right.
for.
He is very sheepish. So why don't we begin with Avdiivka, and I'm going to send you a map. Um, this is kind of like what Avdiivka looks like now as the February 28th. And you can see the Russians have expanded a huge area west of Avdiivka. Uh, the show that we did last, the Russians I mean, there were several factors that helped the Russians take Avdiivka. You could argue that it was a 2 kilometer stretch of the underground passage in the south that let them pop up at the Tsar Hunt hotel. That definitely threw the Ukrainians off. You could argue that the Russians' diligent work against Ukrainian air defense systems, blowing them up, including at least one or two Patriots, might have also helped. But I think, of course, all these factors played a major role. But I think the interesting thing is, and I'm trying to find an image. Yes, yes, and this image will kind of clarify. So we're going back now 11 days, and I think this clarifies it really well. You can see where the Russians have, particularly in the north, expanded, bifurcating of Avdiivka. And in a way, this sealed the fate. Um, this stopped the coke plant to the north from effectively, because in the basement, those guys are pretty much immune to any attack from the Russians. And there are so many intricate places, and the area is so vast that it's a difficult place to attack head on. In fact, it could even be suicidal, you might argue, right? But what the Russians did is they went literally for the weakest spot, and they bifurcated the town. And in a way, this sealed the fate. Now, if you look at where it says Avdiivka, if you look at the capital A, directly beneath that area is this sort of round, squarish, circular area. That's the citadel. That's the area with nothing but high rises. And this is where the Air Force went to work. And incidentally, the general responsible for the planning of this attack, and of course, the attack, early on was not great. There were many difficulties. For instance, Media Zona has a loss of 6,000 to 6,100 confirmed deaths for the Russians from, I believe, October 9th to February the 14th. That's a significant amount, and it's some people have speculated that about 3,700, about 60% of those happen in Avdiivka. So that's a lot. That's I don't know, that's almost 100 a day, maybe 75 a day for the entire front line, but it's also a significant 60% of that is happening in Avdiivka. Um, there was also some debate about did Azov fight or not? Did they retreat? I think the story is kind of in the middle. One of the things the Ukrainians didn't do is if you're looking at this map, is they didn't fight on the flanks. And maybe one of the reasons that they didn't fight on the flanks and went where the Russian breakthrough um, was because it would take too long. And basically, it was a done deal that if you fight on the flanks, as you did in Bakhmut, that would just buy the Russians more time to work within the city. Now, by the 13th and 14th, the city, Syrski did not order a retreat, and uh, um, Tarankovsky or Tarkovsky, who was like the local officer general in this area, he did not give the order for a retreat. Now, there was an order, I believe, on the 16th or 15th for the 110th, and the 110th Brigade is the brigade that's been defending Avdiivka, shelling Donetsk, et cetera, for 2 years. And you would think by the telegram post that some kind of organized retreat did happen. Well, it didn't, and one of the reasons we know it didn't is because one of the officers, I believe a lieutenant, or it might have been captain, um, began giving some messages and for a retreat. Now, if you look at the map, if you follow the word Avdiivka down, you follow that and you see a Ukrainian salient that's very bulbous with a narrow neck. Okay, that bulbous area is where there's an air defense system. Air defense grounds were there. The Russians had partial control of this about a week or two earlier, and they lost it. And the Ukrainians moved back in. They believe that there are underground passages there. Now, a member of the 110th, of course, recorded being there. I think he was stuck with 6 wounded guys, and he was told by this commanding officer, like, okay, the last um, evacuation is happening. So this younger officer says, what about the wounded? He goes, we're not going to take any wounded. All told, according to both Ukrainian media and the New York Times, there were 350 wounded and another 400 to 600 um, not wounded, captured. So about 1,000 guys, 850 to 1,000 guys were captured. 350 of them might have been wounded. Now, the bodies of those 6 wounded, I think, were found there. I could be wrong. Um, I don't know if history legends mentioned that, but I think it was the case in one of the telegram posts. And so what happened was there was a kind of a rout, and Ukrainians began leaving in small streams of men. They had to walk. Now, from this Air Force air defense base, it's a 1 kilometer walk to get to the Citadel. And from what the guy from the 110th was saying, something like 80% weren't even making it. There was a group of 10 that left. 3 came back, 2 initially, and then a third, all wounded, came back. The last one came back in the morning. So this shows you just how difficult this was. And I think the role of Azov was to provide some kind of armored mobile defense that, in other words, infantry fighting vehicles and uh, armored personnel carriers, basically to get these guys out, right? And they couldn't take wounded, so all the wounded got left behind. The other difficult thing is the Russians had also mined the passageways, the rural roads that are just they're mud roads. They're not paved, with mines. And when the retreat began happening from the Citadel and north, maybe where the coke plant is, the first waves, of course, had to go. These guys were sacrificed. They had to go through the minefields. And in fact, that commander that was part of the 110th, that was at the air defense base, he mentions this, having to go over the bodies of these guys who were part of the first wave, and the Russians just harassed them with FPV drones. We don't know what the total losses were, but this was certainly one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Um, it's not as bloody as Bakhmut or the first, let's say, 3-4 weeks of the war when it initially started. Um, I could give you a kind of cross section. So here is yeah, there we go. There you are. So this is basically the 6,100 confirmed deaths from October the 10th to February the 14th. That's the area that it encapsulates, and you can see it's high, but it's not what it was from like January to March of 2023, right? This is when a lot of the fighting was happening for Bakhmut, and of course, there's many other areas. So You can see that this is about average, but kind of higher than what it was in September and August. Anyways, so very grueling fighting. What it looks like the Ukrainians did, based on some of the videos that I saw, was they were trying to get the last remnants of these guys out. You also have to understand that in Selidovid, that village that I talked about, where the Russians attacked them, I mean, really, it's anywhere from 200 to 300 guys are gone. Uh, like I say, I saw Ukrainian posts saying 200, 100 to 200, and I don't have contacts with the Ukrainian military the way Weeb Union and History Legend does, but History Legend said 300, which is absolutely massive. Um, I only recall one other strike that was as big as that. If because of course, we don't know how many died in that strike at the NATO training base just outside of Lvov. Um, but there was another one that happened, I believe, just west of Kiev. Anyhow, that was in April of 2022. So um, this was like I say, both sides suffered heavy losses. I think they're heavy. I mean, 6,100 in 4 or 5 months. I mean, that's pretty serious, I think. Russia lost 22,000 men, according to Media Zona, in 2023. Of course, we'll never know what the Ukrainians lost because no one will ever tell us. But according to Zelensky, only 31,000 are dead. Now, there was a reporter who sent out who got the leaks on the actual figures, and he's been charged. So um, that figure was in the hundreds of thousands, so it was much higher. Again, as I've always said on this show, I don't know. We don't know for sure. This is going to be a job for historians, and it'll depend which historians and on what side.
I mean,
So
you just have to consider that there are wars that happened throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Now, maybe not Vietnam. I think enough time has passed where they have really been able to take account there. But
yeah,
think the Iran-Iraq War. Think the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from 75 to 91, I think. But point being is, all these various conflicts throughout the course of the latter half of the 20th century, where they still really don't have an exact number, and they still
yeah,
are collecting information on this. I mean, I know it's not a war, but just in terms of mass casualty events, they still haven't identified every victim of September 11th. But so these
yeah,
things can take decades, quite literal decades, to sort out. And we're talking about the largest war since in both lives and in scope since World War II.
yeah.
This is going to take decades to sort out, and frankly, some of us might not even be alive to see the
Oh, for
final
sure.
estimations.
Yeah. I mean, the Americans lost an F-18 Hornet way back, I think, with the first war in Iraq, and might have been the second, but I think it was the first. And they did not disclose that that had happened until after 2010. So they had to essentially lie about this for over a decade,
And
but
that's
they
that,
always
that's
knew.
that's one of many cases of just events like that. And in terms of, in particular, declassifications documents that quote unquote reach the public, now how uncensored they are, how untampered they are, I suppose that is up for debate, and I do think there is a conversation to be had there. But with that being said, we're talking things that happened in the 50s and 60s that are just now becoming declassified. And my point and your point, to build off of that, is that there are so many pieces to speculate, especially at this point, while this is active and ongoing. Anyone who claims they know is either lying to you or has no idea what the situation actually is, because they would know that you
Yeah.
cannot come to a reasonable conclusion on this. Now, I hate to even hazard a guess, but I would imagine that the Ukrainian casualties, if I just had to pick a number just on gut feeling, not quite, but hovering around 100,000. And I would say that the Russian casualties are probably less, but not by that much, honestly. Just with the kind of war that this has been, and with what a grind it has been. Now, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, depending on who you ask, the reported civilian casualties in this war from both sides have actually been quite low, in which I
Yeah.
am inclined to believe that because I do think that in a lot of these areas that civilian evacuations, either by the volition of the Russian or the Ukrainian side, did take place. I mean, look at what they charged Putin with at the International Criminal Court of kidnapping 40,000 children, where it was just moving these children in the Donbass away from a war zone. Once again,
Many of
love
them are already orphans.
exactly love Russia, hate Russia. I think anyone who's being honest with themselves can agree that yeah, it's better for these 40,000 orphans to be in an area that's not being shelled in an active war zone, even if it is on the quote unquote wrong side. But of course, some people, you'll never get them to admit to anything like that. But getting back to yeah, the civilian casualties are very low, and I mean, I know a lot of comparisons to World War One get thrown around with the type of combat and the slow moving front lines. And I know clearly during World War Two, with just the scale of industrial warfare, the civilian casualties were much higher than World War One. But I don't have the civilian casualty figures for World War One on hand, but I believe they were actually significantly lower than the Second World War. But I would
Yeah.
be curious to compare those numbers considering the kind of war this is and the way it has been conducted thus far. And not even to give too much credit to the Ukrainians because I think you all know where I stand, and I think where both of us really stand on this war. Not that the Russians are perfect, not that they have not that they're completely moral. I mean, there's no such thing as a completely moral army, completely moral person. I'm sure you all get the point I'm making here, but I would say just the way they've conducted themselves in general. But getting back to this, just on the topic of civilian casualties, I mean, and we don't even need to compare this to what's happening in, of course, the Middle East and Gaza and Palestine right now because there's simply no comparison to be made. And a lot of people across the political spectrum, across viewpoints on this, have actually pointed this out as well. There's just simply no comparison to be made with something like that. But it's there are so many unknowns. The fact that even us who get on here almost every week and break down what happened, the past events, and keep track of this war on an almost day by day sense, even what we do is only scratching the surface. And you can look at
Yeah.
other people who do very good, very detailed work, like you said, military summary, history, legends, all those people. I once again, they're people. Weeb Union, another one. People I go to almost every day, or whenever they put stuff out to see what's happening, because I do think that there's some of the best in the circuit as it is. Even what they do compared to how vast this is, only scratches the surface. I think people need to keep that in mind when they look at these sort of things,
Mm.
and that this is also very gradual. They're very glacial movements, and something that may seem insignificant at the time can have ramifications in the long term. Or something that may seem major may not take effect immediately. But I mean, just get to my overall point that there is so much we don't know, and that we will likely never know just because of the nature of something like this.
Yeah. Now I'm going to send you another map, and this map and the one that'll come right afterwards will explain, I think, the tactical situation of what the Russians will be up against. So this map is from the end of January, beginning of February, where the Russians controlled significantly less land, right? But I wanted to bring your attention to, and if you can't see it, I'm gonna send you this photo here. You can have the two side by side. And these little yellow marks are actual trenches, dugouts, underground passages that the Ukrainians, these are fortifications that the Ukrainians have built. And they're in yellow here, right? You can see how extensive this is just outside of Deivka, right? Um, they pocket all they sort of pockmark the map everywhere, right? And these were not built in 2022. They were built a long, over the 8 years preceding the SMO, right? So that tells you um, just how invested Ukraine was in an eventual war with Russia. Don't tell me that the Ukrainians expected uh, the Donbass people that they outnumbered like 20 to 1 to like drive through this area, and that's why all these fortifications had to be built. No, they have always been expecting this war. And if you look at the larger map with the red arrows, you can see like how they were dug in around the airport, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, that strip with a red line intersecting. It's beneath the bottom arrow. These are all fortifications that had to be taken, but you can see how extensive they are further west. The thing is, the Russians now are getting close to this area, but not quite. And this area is basically that the Russians are taking is on the low ground. I'm going to show you their progress, a little bit of a blow up from today. Um, so the towns that the Russians have already taken are Stepove, Orlovka, Severnye, Lastochnike. They're all taken, and some of them fell a few days ago. And of course, everything around Avdiivka is gone. But again, you can see what is awaiting the Russians with all this extensive work, and this is on higher terrain too, where these fortifications have been made. So that is one of the reasons why things have progressed as slow as they have, because the the remedy for air bombardment is to dig deeper into the ground. Here's a terrain map that gives you an idea of the salient. The Russians have progressed further. Those arrows now are closer to the cities, like not cities. These are towns, Orlovka and Tonenkie. So that gives you an idea of how this is being fought, and you can see that if you compare the photo with all the fortifications, if the Russians want to go from the north, there's a lot of fortifications they have to go through. We'll see if Russia's Air Force, which is performing quite well, can make the difference. Because the Ukrainians have lost 5, 6 towns now, or villages to be more precise, since they took Avdiivka. The other area where things have been happening is in Robotino. So I'll send you a map now. Now, the Russians had made a lot of progress in this map, but the Ukrainians have managed to push them back. Again, Robotino is in a flat area. It is lower in elevation compared from the north and from the south. But the thing that the Russians have done is to the east of it, going rightward, you can see that the Russians have retaken one of the Surovikin lines completely, around Verbove, and they've moved quite a bit north on the first Surovikin line. This is the tank trench. This is meant to, you know, impede the progress of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. That salient wasn't there when you left, but the Russians are having a difficult time of um, of trying to keep Robotino. They've taken the southern part, but they're unable to hold the center in the north. And then there's speculation, just to briefly return to of the. I'm sorry to do this, but there's speculation about where um, the second line of defense might eventually be, and this gives you an idea where that would be, and it kind of clarifies what I was talking about. The higher elevations, the greater difficulty there will be to take these areas because they're not only higher, but there's also a lot of trench networks there. Um, and here's a blow up of the gains from, let's say, the last 24 to 36 hours or so. Uh, yep. Anyhow, so that's Avdeevka. I showed you Rabotino. There's some fighting in Kupiansk, of course. No major changes. Bakhmut, the Russians have made gains there. Uh, um, Toward Ivanivske. Ivanivske is one of those villages just outside of Bakhmut, and after that is Chasov Yar. The other sort of interesting thing that the Russians have done is they've moved into an area called Krasnogorovka, which is which is not far from it's not far from Avdeevka. It's around the Donetsk area, and they're attacking from the south. I don't. Let me see if I have. Yes, here it is, Krasnogorovka. So you can see the recent gains that they've been making there. I believe they're even closer now. Um, and then an image of the Russians working towards taking Ivanivske. Again, this is in Bakhmut. Bakhmut is on the right, and then Ivanivske is this village. Now, in the top left-hand corner, that is Chasov Yar. Um, And then lastly, I'm going to send you two images. This is when these fortifications were colored in blue, which makes them blue on blue. Honestly, you can hardly see them. So I did this close up of just how extensive these fortifications are. Now, the ones in the Donetsk region, of course, they've been there a very long time. I'm going to presume the ones in Zaporozhye are more new, but they have expected this for quite a while. So this war was always destined to happen. Let me see if I have. No. Well, that's good enough for now. The other thing is the Ukrainians managed to, not managed, but tried to attack an area in the Crimean Peninsula. In English, it's called the Tentra Spit Islands. Um, I think in Russian is Trendovka. Uh, uh, um, Trendrovsky or Trendrovka for female. Okay, so that's an image of like where this attack happened. So several boats had gone there, and close to two dozen guys have been killed. One of them was captured. One of the boats managed to escape. And of course, it's insane. It's a suicide mission. Like, why would you do this? Well, the reason they have to do this is they have like a population in the West, but primarily in America, if they're watching, um, and they're low information and high emotional investment, and you know their lives are busy with other things. They're not doing podcasts, so they'll see a headline, you know, oh they landed here, oh they landed there, and they will of course fill in the rest, right? This is kind of like D-Day, or maybe this will be successful, unlike the summer counteroffensive. Um, but that's not the case. These guys are there to pull a headline. If they hadn't been killed before they landed, then they would have been killed soon after. Like the smart techniques that the Ukrainians did do was taking over the oil rigs. Now, I don't know if they're still there, but way back in August and September, I believe they did that to at least two of them. And from there, they, created information beacons, probably with their, what's the system that Musk created? Something
Starlink,
Starlink, yeah.
which conspicuously
Not,
through the United Arab Emirates, Russia actually got access to Starlink satellites
yeah, they
recently.
have hundreds, according to Budanov. Um, so yeah, they are being donated. People are buying Starlink mini satellite dishes or whatever they are, and they're giving them to the Russian army. So both armies now are using Starlink. But all to go back, that taking over these platforms, right? It's risky. Maybe you're going to get bombed eventually, right? It is isolated. Like if you get hurt on one of these things, getting rescued is going to be a real chore. But we often think, the American Reaper drones and the American AWACS that are flying in this area, helping them coordinate the Ukrainian strikes on the Russian Navy, is just them. But for all we know, these oil platform, oil rigs, offshore oil rigs, could have been places that the Ukrainians used to, attack the Russian Navy. So like that's a kind of a smarter um, application of their men, but it doesn't grab the headlines, right? Because everybody knows, like, if this war goes on and they're not being able to kick out the Russians, right, people will lose interest, and so therefore they're forced to fight. They're forced to fight a kind of insane war with many suicidal attacks. Krinky, for instance, now is secured by the Russians. Um, that was I mean the Russians lost men too trying to push them out, and you could argue that the Ukrainians of course knew that they would never expand from there, but for a Western audience, right, they do expect that. And maybe you've got 3 months where you don't have to worry about what the Western audience thinks, but eventually the news will come around that you made, like, you landed in a town on the other side of the Dnieper, you were there for 3 months, and then you got kicked out, and it cost you like over 1,000 men, all to be pushed out.
And,
So
and that's why Zaluzhny had to go, because he was, love him or hate him, far too pragmatic for those
yes,
kind of moves. He didn't want to have the cinematic actions,
yes,
the
yes,
headline grabbers, the things that do appeal to the low information Westerner, because as you had brought up, there's a cycle that goes into this. So the Ukrainians, who are reliant on Western aid, will pull off some sort of headline grabbing maneuver that will trickle back to the West. Western governments will approve aid packages with the at least passive consent of the general public, because they realize that these Ukrainian fighters are clearly doing something right. They landed on this island, they had this offensive, they had this breakthrough in some town I never heard of until 5 minutes ago. So therefore, more aid is justified because Russia is bad and we need to stand with our allies, even though we have no obligation to Ukraine, even by any formal treaty. It's so on and so forth. But then, when you saw this over the past few months, I would say past 3 or 4 months, where the news is less favorable to Ukraine, And you'll notice that was also in the lead up to Zaluzhny's dismissal, where you have these articles that call into question the efficacy of Ukraine's war effort and the real state on the ground and whether it's sustainable and if it's really worth the cost. Then you get the public starting to sour on it. And then sometimes it'll become a partisan issue in the US where the Republicans go back and forth where they support aid to Ukraine, they're skeptical of aid to Ukraine, and they flip flop on it. Whereas on the left wing, the establishment, the Democratic side, it's pretty consistent that aid to Ukraine is a priority. But and then of course there's other things that, and putting aside the trivial stuff that usually dominates the news cycle, but in terms of stuff that actually matters, for example, you'll have the flare up between Israel and Palestine. You'll have economic issues. You'll have the border issue that will also come in public consciousness that will draw attention away from Ukraine, which can be both to their advantage and to their detriment, depending on how they want to spin it, because it does draw attention away from the admittedly failing war effort in Ukraine, which allows them to do things behind the scenes. But also, when you see another aid package get passed when Ukraine isn't in the spotlight, it starts to raise some eyebrows. But you make a great point that a lot of, in fact, the entirety of the Ukraine war effort, as we all know, number one, yes, is based on Western sponsors, but that Western sponsorship deal is in a large part affected by the fickleness of Western public opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so, I mean, what this would be, I mean, how can I put it? If it was a country that was really in charge of its own destiny, it wouldn't be like this. It would have, partners that would be willing to help, naturally. But at the same time, it like its funders, like its bank or whatever, like it would go on a war footing. You know, it wouldn't happen like this, and yet that's the price you pay. Um, when you have two different countries, one of them controls the military supply, the economics, and everything else, and even most of the planning. Um, so it's kind of a ridiculous situation to be in, but it's the one they chose.
And I'll point out once again, and this will lead into some of the other Ukraine stories I have. NATO had 8 years from actually the end of 2013 is when Yanukovych fell out of power, and then you had the transitional government and Poroshenko coming into power around March, April of 2014, which March 2014 is also when Crimea was annexed by the Russians. But you had roughly 8 years in between the Maidan and the Russian intervention on 2/24/22 for NATO to build up Ukraine to the standards of an army. Now, mind you, Ukraine, you have a lot of resources. You have quite a bit of manpower. Now, I know emigration, even before the war, was an issue, but compared to most other European countries, you still had a quite large pool of manpower. You had resources. You had at least the latent industry. I know a lot of that was in the Donbass, but once again, you still had a very industrialized country to build into a country that can sustain a war effort for the inevitable attack of the Russians or inevitable intervention of the Russians, I'd say, because the war was going on otherwise. And I suppose that brings up a couple possibilities. We could look at this that
Mm.
NATO was just incompetent; they were kicking the can down the road. Maybe they never really expect this conflict or a conflict of this scale. Maybe they bought into their own propaganda too much, where they thought Russia was a paper tiger that would collapse upon first contact with the Ukrainians. Who knows? I mean, you have some of the wargaming of this where they used Iraq as a model for Russia. And I no, I'm not making that up. They used Iraqi figures from I believe the first Gulf War as a model for how Russia would perform or as just a comparison for the Russians. And then something else we can consider with this is did they want to run the risk of industrializing reindustrializing Ukraine, building it up into a formidable military power that yes, maybe could have held off the Russians better, but would still inevitably come to that, and then you have all of that NATO infrastructure and military hardware in the hands of the Russians. That's another possibility. Or did they just not trust Ukraine even after the Maidan, even after they went in and they had their agents on the ground cooperate with sympathetic Ukrainian forces to establish a regime in their favor? Did they really fear that perhaps Ukraine would flip back to the Russians and that would just all be a lost investment if they put all of that into Ukraine? I mean, how confident were they in the Ukrainian project from the Maidan onward? And given the level of purges both in the civil government and military administration, I would say a there's probably a great deal of fear or apprehension, I suppose would be the more appropriate word, towards the idea of Ukraine maybe not being the bulwark that they had wanted against the Russians, and that the way this invasion played out actually did play out in their favor because of the amount of purging work that they did do within both civil and military administration in Ukraine. But either no matter how you spin this, no matter how you cut this, whether NATO just kicked the can down the road and failed to prepare its proxy state for this war with Russia, or they didn't entirely trust it, so they didn't properly prepare in that regard either. There's no real winning answer to that question. There's nothing that really makes them
Mhm.
look better. And then once again, getting the reports that they provided just this mismatch of weapons, even though they all were quote unquote NATO standard, to Ukraine with no real supply chain to support these, no real repair mechanisms, no steady chain of munitions for the weapons that they're providing, or other vital equipment in order to keep these things online, keep them as part of functional military, on top of having the personnel in the Ukrainian military, in the AFU, who are trained to operate these. It all just looks rather clownish, and I know that there's been the normal fear mongering that they've tried to dust back off. What if Russia makes its moves on the Baltic states after this war is over? Blah blah blah. But in all seriousness, this does have to cause some of these smaller NATO countries that, whether justified or not, and I would say more on the side of not, who do fear that they might be next after Ukraine, how effective NATO is as a defensive force. And look, I know Ukraine wasn't a member, but for all intents and purposes, it was. It was treated as a member, and it was built up for this. But you do have to question if you are Poland, if you are the Baltic states, if you're Romania, any of these countries that have this fear, whether justified or not, of the Russians marching in tomorrow. How confident are you in the military infrastructure of NATO to help defend you?
Yeah, I mean, those are valid takeaways. I've thought about them as well, but I think if you apply like a really cynical perspective on the war,
Of course.
uh, like you could say basically the Americans knew that they could not take Ukraine, that Russia would respond. Um, so the best thing to do is to wreck Ukraine. Of course, Putin will be blamed for wrecking Ukraine, but Putin has to decide whether he wants a NATO base in Crimea and what Russia's future would be if that was the case. So his choice isn't as simple like a crazy madman just wants to destroy Ukraine, beautiful Ukraine. Um, I think what the Americans let's say the criticism that you bring, which is valid, right, is probably like even within the elites, I would say, maybe 70% of them would come to these conclusions, after the war is now obviously not going as planned. But for the elite of the elite, let's say they know that Ukraine can't win this, that it would be too risky and stupid to fight a war directly with Russia. and that that would give China far too much power. So the best thing is to devise a scenario where Ukraine just gets wrecked, like you just wreck, and these are the circumstances where Ukraine will get wrecked if they can't get those valuable resources. Because you have all these Azov dudes, and even non-Azov dudes. Like I've been following this war since 2014, and TV shows like Hromadske or whatever the way it's pronounced. Basically saying, yeah, this land in Donbass is actually very valuable. We need it, but we got to get rid of the people there. So they were always blatant about it. They've always had a kind of supremacy complex when thinking about their fellow citizens in eastern Ukraine. And so the way the Americans kind of look at it is, well, Ukrainians, they're kind of just they're Russians wearing Ukrainian uniforms and they're dying, and Russians wearing Russian uniforms are also dying. And this is the best outcome that we can hope to have,
I, I'm
right?
I'm glad you bring that up because there actually is a bit of a horseshoe that forms where the Russians and the elite of the Americans do fundamentally both view this as a civil war of sorts,
Yeah.
where, of course, the Americans they couldn't care less. They couldn't care about the Ukrainians. They're glad that they're being thrown to the meat grinder on behalf of their project. And
Yeah, they tell you about
yeah,
it. It's not costing us
oh yeah,
anything.
not a single. We haven't had to spill a single drop of blood, or we haven't lost a single man fighting the war in Ukraine. I mean, despite the fact that you can get into the amount of American mercenaries who have been,
Not just that,
yeah.
but while you were gone, another confirmed HIMARS destroyed, and two of them sent back for repairs.
Oh wow.
So we know that again, maybe they could have Ukrainians that are already like fully trained now, but generally all these HIMARS attacks are approved by the U.S. And they're done on civilians often,
And
not exclusively, but often.
it's safe to assume that yes, American crews are operating a
Yeah,
lot of
and
this
they're dead.
weaponry. And I mean, like, this isn't unprecedented. You can go back to the Korean War. That actually there was a case where um, some of the I can't quite remember. I think it might have been either the MiG 15 or MiG 17, where Soviet pilots were operating them on behalf of North Korea, but
Yes.
under
Yep.
Korean colors, etc., etc.
Yep.
So this kind of thing happens all the time.
All the time.
But
Covert
yes,
wars.
yes, but and then you get back to the Russian side where they also do view this as a civil war. That a lot of these uh, people in Ukraine are Russians under the occupation of a breakaway regime, and it it does line up that way. And as you were saying, I do think that they were setting up Ukraine to be destroyed, where they realized that no, we can't conquer the country. Sure, we can put a puppet regime in here, but there's too many internal divisions. We're not going to wrestle Ukraine fully away from Russia. So we're going to destroy all the resources there, make the Russians do it, have them break everything because we can't have it, and then of course we can pin the blame on them. We can point the finger at them, turn them once again into the quote unquote rival that we want, and position the Europeans against them, so on and so forth. And I mean, in that way, it worked out. I know there's a lot of people, even on our side, who are really adamant about spinning just the entire fact that the Ukraine war happened as a victory for the American Empire. In which case, I do think that early on there was some credence to that view, but given the way this war is played out for American reputation, for both American and European military stockpiles and industry, and
Yeah, yeah.
for the revitalization of Russian military power and industry, that didn't quite pan out. Like I said, I can see where the take may have originated, but at this point, I think it has been. I don't think it's stood the test of time. Now I know we've only had this war going on for, at least in the capacity that it's happening now, the state of Russia versus the state of Ukraine for 2 years, but once again, even 2 years on, I don't think that view has been vindicated. Not that it was, like I said, I don't want to just say, oh, it was ridiculous. You're stupid for ever having thought that in the first place. But like I said,
I
looking
mean,
back,
there is a streak in America of Asiatic despotism, you know, with
yes,
and General Patton is like one of these guys, but most Americans kind of think that way. They do like to imagine themselves as crusaders and everything, but they're no different than the Israelis who are always worried about too many losses and you know, on the ledger, always counting who had more losses. So there is this kind of Asiatic quality about Americans, and there isn't really as much heroism as you might think. You know, Patton's famous words, you know, in war, you make the other bat son of a bitch die for his country, right? Um, so, um, yeah, so everything kind of goes through this lens. Most Americans are kind of not really aware that they think like this, or like kind of like how to, I don't know,
you know, I'm glad
how
you
historic nations look at them as kind of like, I don't know, kind of beneath them for thinking like this,
I
because we kind of do.
I'm glad you brought that up because, and I don't want to get too far off topic with this, but you do see this a lot around when people talk about the Vietnam War. They'll talk about how the Americans actually had a higher kill count of Vietnamese and Viet Cong than
Yeah.
vice versa. But point being is, wars are one at the negotiating table, and looking at the outcome of Vietnam is we lost because we lost at the negotiating table. Like, and yes, that you can talk about prowess of military force, but when said military force, even if you do take out millions upon millions of the enemy or deal them, I mean, sure, you can make it a costly victory for them. You could even argue that you could make it a victory that wasn't worth it. At the end of the day, when it comes to an outcome of the war, it's well, like, it goes back to what Clausewitz said that war is just the continuation of politics, where at the end of the day,
Yeah. I mean,
it ends in political settlement.
take a look at Iran, right? Take a look at the loss of life for the revolution. Take a look at the loss of life of an 8-year war with Iraq, right? America funding both sides, et cetera, supplying them with poison gas and whatnot. Um, uh, to Saddam. Well, Iran is still here, right? It's a historic nation, and they're fully conscious that they've been around for thousands and thousands of years, not hundreds, thousands. And the same applies to the Chinese, right? So they don't, you know, um, they're a lot tougher than the Americans think, and they have a way of persisting. And like I say, I mean, we were saying this even before the war started, like that there would be like all kinds of if the war starts going bad for the West, there'll be all this kind of coping about, well, at least Russia lost more men. It'll be this kind of thing. Um, but in the end, you won't get your NATO base in the Black Sea. And, you know, you won't have that kind of that hegemony you always wanted.
No, and I suppose with that being said, we should get into Macron's comments.
Oh yeah, yeah. And we should also get into Navalny.
Oh yes, of course. I suppose now that Navalny completely slipped my mind because that's frankly how irrelevant it turned out being. But the same day, February 17th, that the Ukrainians ordered the retreat of Avdiivka and the city fell to the Russians, Navalny found dead in Russian prison. And this dominated the headlines. This dominated Western media. I mean, it was actually interesting when this happened because I was for both these events because I was in the same time zone as Ukraine
Mm-hmm.
when I was on vacation. And no, I was not on a clandestine mission to Ukraine for the sake for look. This show would be a lot more interesting. This episode would be a lot more interesting if that were the case. So I'll leave you to stop the speculations, and we're just going to shut down that conversation right now. But I remember flipping through the channels just to I don't know when I'm in other places I like to see what kind of media they get beamed with, and I ended up on the BBC and somehow of course just can't avoid it, and they were talking about Navalny's death within the same time I'm looking at Telegram, seeing in real time the fall of Avdiivka, and it was
Yes.
uh, it was a surreal contrast. Now, of course, what came out immediately was clearly Putin did this. Now, the official cause from his name escapes me, but he's Navalny's. He was his pretty much his right hand man in terms of their little quote unquote revolutionary movement in Russian politics. More or less said that it was a blood clot that did it, which raises some questions. Where did that blood clot come from? I think we could talk
Pfizer
about.
blood clot.
I, are you telling me that Navalny didn't take the Sputnik 5? That's
No, no, he didn't.
I can't believe that Putler made him take the inferior vaccination, which led to this tragedy. See that the blood really is on his hands in terms of that.
Well, you bring up an interesting point because Budanov, Zelensky's been everywhere. He was at the Berlin conference. Of course, Navalny dies like on the same day or the day before. His wife is there. Also, interestingly, Navalny's lawyer visited him at the penal colony 2 days before he died. Um, but what Budanov said, and for people who don't know, Kirill Budanov is the intelligence spy chief. Now, this is fascinating because while Zelensky is doing this news conference in Ukraine, I believe he's in Albania now, um, which is what the second most corrupt country. Like, here's a country that has like access to the Mediterranean, like it's not landlocked, and it's like it's a shithole. But anyways,
Hey,
so
but they run organized crime outfits in every neighboring nation. Okay, I think that is an accomplishment.
I said this to my dad, and he says, "What do you mean their ports aren't moving valuable merchandise, drug, sex trafficking, organ trafficking?" So, um, so Zelensky is doing this news conference. Budanov happens to be there. Again, it's for that channel, Hromadske, okay, and right after the show, or maybe somewhere not quite backstage, but Budanov is there surrounded by cameramen and reporters, and they ask him about Navalny. And he says, I hate to disappoint you, but our intelligence in Russia, from a neutral source, he underlined that, uh, indicates that he died of a blood clot. He was not killed, right? The day that he made that statement, which I believe was on the Sunday, today's the Wednesday, the New York Times, their Sunday edition, published a story about how they created Unit 2245 and Budanov became an officer. They immediately started reforming, Ukrainian intelligence from 2014 and 2016. They were creating new units, and of course they mentioned Budanov. So I think now this is very interesting. Suppose Navalny has been poisoned. Now for Russia, it would be very hard to prove that somebody else besides them poisoned him, right? To a skeptical Western public. But I think in many ways, Putin isn't even trying anymore to appeal to Western audiences, and I would say that's a good flex. It could very well be that the lawyer who visited him 2 days prior might have given him something if he didn't die of a blood clot. Navalny did have health issues. He was also like early stages diabetes, if I'm not mistaken. That's according to one article I read. So, like, for me, Budanov saying that, if he's being factual and true, and he actually even believes it, then this is kind of like a nothing burger. But judging by the way the British pounced on this right away, like 10 minutes after it was announced, they're right on it, right? And um, you have to ask yourself why. Like, I mean, the payoff is there. You don't have to do it. Like, the sooner you do it, the more incredulous you look. So that was kind of interesting. That I marked. But his wife being at the Munich Security Conference, saying she's going to take over. Of course, she says she addressed the EU today, EU Parliament. Putin killed my husband. Meanwhile, she's apparently like being shagged by some Jewish oligarch. Like,
Who
the whole
among
thing
us
is
is
so
not?
torrid and pathetic. Um, the thing is Navalny is more useful dead than alive. You have to ask yourself, right? If you believe what happened in 2020, that he was poisoned by somebody sneaking poison into his suitcase, into like a specific pair of underwear, like, think how stupid that is, right? And then he's treated at a hospital by the Russians in Russia. They save his life, or they stabilize him. It doesn't look like there was enough poison to kill him. It's Novichok. Now, officially, Russia doesn't even make Novichok anymore, but you know the UK and the US do, and they're open about that. And then you think about the the Skripals, right, who were poisoned, less than 5 kilometers from also another Novichok place, right? Novichok is all over this park, doesn't kill anybody, but it makes those two sick, the father and daughter. And again, when does that happen? It happens just before an election in 2018. Navalny dies basically 4 weeks before the election. And I'm sure there's people who are waiting for the burial, right? They're hoping that the autopsy takes a long time. And, that will foster protests during the election. So there's no benefit for Putin to kill him before the election. I mean, if you're going to kill him after the election. The other thing is, um, I'm losing my train of
He
thought.
was completely
Oh yeah,
neutralized as a political threat. He was languishing in a Siberian prison. He's not
but he
going.
didn't even have to come back. He spent
No.
5 months in Germany, okay, and the whole time he's gaining press, blah blah blah. And I talked about this on the show even before, right at the end of 2023. I said, he's more useful. Like, he had to go back, right? He comes back January 2021. Remember, the war nearly broke out in April 2021, not February 2022. The same shelling, the use of Bayraktar drones on the people of Donbass, right? Russia starts moving troops, but in June 2021, Putin and Biden meet in Vienna, and there's an accord. And so the war doesn't begin. Russia starts building up more troops because, of course, there's still going to be a war because the provocations won't stop. And then we have a few months later, the war begins in 2022. Now, for those who were extremely optimistic on the Western side, right, the sanctions should have tanked Russia. There should have been more, not less, diplomatic isolation. So Russia would have gotten into trouble. And, Navalny was a nobody, but when he was poisoned through his underwear, um, he did gain a lot of sympathy in Russia. Now, he was a nobody who pulled almost nothing his entire career, but when that happened, there were protests and people did empathize with him, right? So when he came back, that was another heroic feat, and he's there. He's there waiting for hopefully a collapse of Russia. Again, the the elites at the highest levels probably suspect that that's not going to happen, right? But remember that America has invested in demonizing Russia more than any country in its history. And it has sanctioned Russia more than any country in its history, more than double that of North Korea, more than North Korea and Syria combined. So Navalny has to play this role where he might unexpectedly be declared a president rather than elected, and then elections would happen later. But at that point, the coup de grace would already have been complete. That would have been his role. I mean, that's what he chose to do. I don't really care about his stupid politics. He was always an opportunist. When Russian fascism was the rave in the late 2000s up until 2014. He was that. Later, he would go to pride parades with his, like, he just he adopted anything and everything,
Oh, the
right?
man
To
had
go.
absolutely no principles at all. And I was actually
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
get into that where he was quote unquote far right and had all those comments about Muslims and Chechens in
But
2008,
yeah, he called them
2012.
cockroaches.
But I mean, I do have to wonder when somebody looks at that, if, even if they are of a more right wing persuasion, say somebody who might be more sympathetic with our views just in general, that wouldn't his turn arguably be worse if you believe that he was completely genuine about that, and then agreed to just to forget all of that for the sake of pursuing power? Isn't that arguably worse than him being an opportunist? But I mean, not that I think he ever generally believed in any of that, and he just went with whatever direction the wind blows. He would have taken any position that would have led him to
Yeah.
power. Frankly, Putin probably could have offered him a cabinet position. He would have accepted the next day. Not that I'm saying it should have happened, but I'm saying it could have happened, and it likely would have played out that way. But
Hmm.
once again, he's a nameless, faceless entity who can be very easily replaced. They never expected him to be like you said, he was somebody who was waiting in the wings to be the manager of a newly collapsed Russia, and that
Yes.
they never expected him to do anything of note. They never expected him to lead anything. I suppose the
He would
closest,
be the face of that.
yeah, Poroshenko is who we could compare him to
Yeah.
realistically in terms of that.
Or like Yatsenyuk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but in terms of, and you'll notice that his death has left the media almost as soon as it entered, and nobody really cares anymore. They've moved on, even in terms of kvetching about Russia, the newest thing, and you can watch the History Legends video. It is actually pretty good, both in terms of contemporary events and historical events. About saying, well, sure, Russia might be making advances, but it's because of human wave tactics, and
Oh
he,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I haven't seen it yet.
he does a pretty good job breaking down why that just is not the case. I would recommend to anyone, but that's what they've moved on to since the Navalny thing didn't really take any hold, because once again, who in the West really knows who Navalny was? And even compare this to the Cold War when they propped up a lot of these uh, Soviet dissidents, where their names escape me. But point being is these people actually had a presence. They were actually able to command some, even just small amount of influence. Navalny was a nobody in Russia. He was a nobody in the West, and that's really going to be his legacy. He's going to be very quickly forgotten about. He's going to be brought up every once in a while when somebody wants to complain about Putin, and bringing it up with other disappearances and deaths surrounding Putin because Russian man bad and all the stuff that they normally get into. I'm thinking back.
Yeah.
Just, I think it was actually quite recently around the interview where Tucker Carlson is like, "Well, yeah, to rule countries, you just have to kill people sometimes." just,
Wow.
it's just like completely mask off, but it just made me think of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, you can say a lot of things, but that honestly really is the case. That in order to lead a country, especially a country in the unique position that Russia is in, that yes, as a head of state, as a ruler, that you do have to exercise violence both on a personal and on a mass scale sometimes. Now,
Yeah.
I, I
What would America do if there was a guy in America, right, who routine, like, everybody knows that his family is paid off by Putin, right? Um, his children live in expensive apartments. They go to whatever the equivalent of Stanford University is, right? Where do they even get their money? He addresses important political bodies all over the world about how terrible America is and how much they need a revolution. And I mean, America has like very serious laws. You would be in prison if you boasted, like, if it turned out that foreign governments are literally funding you for an insurrection or a coup, right?
Oh
Like
yeah,
America would never even tolerate this.
we've
So,
disappeared people over far less. And while I will just clarify the statement that I have no sympathy with the current regime in America, just speaking objectively, speaking on principle, if you have somebody running around like that, yeah, you're going to go to prison. You can be the most fervent believer in free speech, whatever. But point being is, when you actively purport yourself as effectively the agents of a as an agent of the foreign government who wants to enact a regime change, it's you're not going to get anywhere. And I suppose the biggest lesson we can take from Navalny is, just to be very trivial about this, is if you're gonna take a swing at the king, don't miss. And
yeah,
like
yeah,
you don't go around being a high profile dissident for that long,
yeah,
expecting no consequence, especially when you return to the country that you've been agitating against. And look, I mean, for example, say what you will about Vladimir Lenin. I certainly have my opinions on him. But if you're going to come back to enact massive political change, make sure you succeed. That's
yeah,
all. That's all I can really say,
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
otherwise, that's going to be your fate. You're going to languish in some prison out in the middle of nowhere before you're either officially executed by the state, unofficially executed by the state, or succumb to whatever illness they let take hold over you. And I'm sure, yeah, one of those three things happened to Navalny. That's not really controversial to say. Look, I'm not going to downplay, just like, you know, look, as bad as he was, like, he still was a human being. So I'm not gonna like stand here and like
Hmm.
dance on his grave too hard, I guess. But point being is, at the end of the day, he's just going to be remembered as a minor political agitator, and especially if Russia does come out on the top of this war and it doesn't trigger a NATO response, which, I mean, barring Macron's bloviations, which we'll get into in a moment, looks like it's going to be the case. He's just going to be remembered as yet another nobody who's just went up against a regime and paid the price for it. And yeah, like I said, some people, especially of a more liberal alignment, will complain about it, whatever. But he's going to be at best a footnote in the history books.
Yeah, like it's important. Like America does thinks nothing of like just keeping the message, right? Like America is messaging, democracy is great. We're a democracy, like if you want to believe that. I mean, not that I care one way or the other, but um, like these people are expendable, right? And you might think like nothing has been achieved, but not everybody not everybody else thinks that. Vilifying Russia is just an important um, geopolitical priority for America. Period. At all times, every year. That just it doesn't change. So, because people will be thinking, well, there just weren't enough gains. Well, why would it do that? No, it's a constant thing, and you're talking about a time where think about how America makes money, right? By the SWIFT system. You have countries that don't include America, but because they use, and SWIFT is not the only one. Um, uh, you know, uh, every transaction they get a cut, right? And you have, basically big countries now with hundreds of billions of dollars of exports who just aren't using that system. They're not using the American dollar anymore, and it's just going to keep going that way. Now, they don't want to provoke America, and if they move too quickly, that could very negatively impact their own economies. But like, no, it's like expending Navalny for this is par for the course. Like you want to create, um, you want to create or recreate or reinstill the uh, all the various tropes about Russia, right? Whether they're true or not.
Yeah, that's really what it goes down to. It's a propaganda victory for who it needs to be. The question is how far can they really stretch that, and at what point are they just going to run out of returns for that? I do think is a question worth exploring. But yeah, you bring a point. It accomplishes exactly what it needs to. Everyone's going to buy
Yeah.
into it. Is going to buy into it. It's going to justify everything they believe. And
Look, after COVID and the elections of 2020 and Floyd and all the kind of ridiculous media messaging, this in the West, people have lost faith in the institutions. So you have to say, well, okay, we suck, but would you rather live in Russia? That proverbial question, like you're just really ready to move, and it doesn't matter, like your life, your roots, and all the other people who depend on you. Like it's, anyways, it's ridiculous, but I mean that is how people do think.
yeah, and I like you said, it gets down to the core of what needs to be done now. On that same note, and with all that being said, I want to get into Macron's comments, but I do want to preface
Hmm.
this. I'm going to share a screenshot of something I saw on a Twitter account called From Kherson, and this is just a breakdown of, and you can see right here, the date is February 18th that this was reported. A breakdown from Ukrainska Pravda of military aged men in Ukraine. And the graphic is in Ukrainian, but thanks to the Twitter account From Kherson, we do have an English translation. So, of the military age men in the country of Ukraine, 26 live in Russian occupied territory, Russian controlled territory.
Hmm.
25% are in a form of employment that is, for somehow, depending on the sector, has exempt them from military service, at least for the time being. 13% are invalids unfit for military service. 11% are active duty. 11% are abroad, and 5% are business owners. And according to the math that's done here, that leaves 9% or 950,000 who are eligible for conscription, if we're to read too much into the statements of Ukrainska Pravda. Now, it is interesting because when it comes to a lot of these, I know a lot of them just simply do not take into the account the number of military-aged men who are living in Russian-controlled territories. But take this with a grain of salt. Like I said, given the source, Ukraine's official propaganda outlet is reporting this. But I do think those are interesting numbers, and it does make you wonder what sectors of employment do exempt you from that, and how many of those quote unquote invalids are actually unfit for service or maybe have the right connections to have a medical condition that does exempt them.
Mm.
And like I said, that brings up a lot of questions, and pretty much the only figures you can really trust there are uh, under Russian controlled territory, abroad, or actually in military service on military duty right now. And the other numbers, like I said, in terms of how genuine or accurate those are, that raises a lot of question marks. But I do think that is an interesting graphic going into Macron's statements about mulling over sending troops into Ukraine, limited NATO expeditionary forces, or whatever nonsense words they want to hide behind. But that also is on the heels of a story that happened on the day that I left. And that
Mm.
is the story that came out of the French media on February 13th about Ukraine allegedly trying to lure Macron during his state visit in Ukraine, assassinating him, and then pinning it on the Russians in order to trigger a NATO intervention. And and apparently Macron actually canceled his visit to Ukraine because of rumors of these reports. And now, once again, this is from the French media.
That is
So
crazy. I
take
know he canceled it. I had no idea
yeah,
that this is what was
yeah,
behind it.
take it with a grain of salt. But this is according to a close source to the French National Intelligence Council. The attempt was stopped by the French Secret Service, who managed to intercept the correspondence, and they caused the participants involved in the potential provocation. And it goes on. This is from the Twitter account at Gabe ZZOZZ. So, like I said, he has the Associated Media clipped with that, and so that if you want to look into that, you can go to his account. The tweet is still up from February 13th. But just to quote directly from what he had said, the idea of the attack was to focus the attention of the world public opinion on Ukraine and allow increase in arms and supplies to Ukraine. The Ukrainian authorities plan to shift responsibility on the attack of the French president onto the Russian side in order to accuse the country of terrorism. So, if we're to believe this French media report that they claim came from an inside source of French intelligence, Ukraine tried to set up a situation in which Macron would be assassinated and the blame would be pinned on the Russians in order to trigger a NATO intervention. And I'd say, although the source is dubious and it's not very well sourced, it does line up with what we know about other Ukrainian attempts at false flags in the past. Now, it's this is far more severe than all the other ones we have seen, which is probably why it didn't go through, and how serious this idea was, whether it was the idea of just a few elements within the SBU or the AFU or whatever else. Maybe this wasn't that serious an idea. Perhaps Zelensky didn't really greenlight this, but and clearly he didn't because it didn't happen. But look, I'll put it this way: if this story were, say, about the prime minister of some no-name European, like the I don't know, the Latvian prime minister or something like that, still a NATO member, but not really a significant country, I would be far more inclined to believe it. Not that I'm inclined to necessarily disbelieve this, but I'm just saying it would have been a far more believable and far more viable plan if they lured somebody from some minister from Latvia or Poland or uh, the Czech Republic, and then had them fall victim to a Russian assassination, a quote unquote Russian assassination attempt, or a quote unquote Russian missile strike on their position. I could see something like that happening where they do sacrifice that, or I don't know, maybe they send Lloyd Austin over there to get hit by another artillery shell and have him hospitalized for an undisclosed amount of time while telling us that it's because of some cancer diagnosis. What I think didn't they say it was some cancer diagnosis with Lloyd Austin? I can't even remember at this point, but out of all the things I've heard out of Ukrainian intelligence, this is, well, like I said, I would need to see more concrete proof of something like this. This is entirely believable. I do think it tracks with everything that we know about the SBU, everything we do know about the Ukrainian war effort. There are some elements that are desperate enough to escalate this war that they would be willing to sacrifice a Western leader. Now, like I said, I think going that big was probably their mistake. That they probably should have went a bit smaller. Like I said, I don't know, perhaps get Pavel from the Czech Republic. And no, I'm not just being prejudiced. Their president's name is I can't remember his first name, but their president's name is Pavel. He was actually one of the uh, top guys in NATO up before his election to the presidency, or the Estonian prime minister that everyone's afraid Russia's going to arrest because of the recent spat that they had there. But I just want to go into this next story with that in mind, the fact that there was an alleged assassination attempt on Macron from Ukrainian intelligence. Like it's alleged, just for the sake of covering all our bases here.
Yeah.
It was reported.
I don't believe it.
No, I like I said, I don't believe it either, but it's not hard to consider that's
Yes.
a possibility.
Well, remember, like, I mean, it's obvious. Obviously, the Americans have been training the Ukrainians to perform assassinations in Russia for decades, but definitely in the last decade. And you know, they nearly killed Dugin. They killed his daughter. So they have the reach, right? They have the reach. And I think a lot of them are hoping that they could kill Putin, you know, because I think there is this kind of, um, this kind of tug of war with like super elites and elites. You could look at Kissinger. Remember his remarks in the beginning of August, late July 2022, where he says, this is basically an unwinnable war for Ukraine. Ukraine should just, and he was attacked for that. But I don't mean to steer you off. Do go on.
No, no, I'm glad you had brought that up, and well, just imagine had that actually been the case. That is the culmination of Macron's career being sacrificed in a false flag. The man, the Jupiterian president, that was his final end. I mean, just that
Yeah.
that would have been very fitting, just honestly, given the course of his political career and everything he represented. But that did not happen. But of course, he comes out and makes the statement that's to the effect that NATO, if Russia does continue to see success in this war, NATO would need to send an expeditionary force because they cannot afford a Russian victory under any circumstance. And then immediately was rebuked by either the head of state or defense minister or foreign minister of just I'm just going to list off a few of the countries that immediately within hours. So there was the UK, Germany, Finland, Spain, Italy. I'm forgetting a few here.
Romania,
Romania.
Bulgaria.
Yeah, Bulgaria came later, but almost immediately there was a wave of
Yeah.
criticism against Macron. The idea that no, we're not at war with Russia. No, we're not going to send an expeditionary force. No, we're not committing NATO forces to this. Oh, Poland was another one,
Yeah,
and
I was just going to say
yeah,
Poland. If Poland and Finland are saying, shut your mouth. No, I don't think so.
yeah, the top two meat grinder countries are if they're not willing to commit to this, then it's simply not happening. But it did raise a lot of concern among Westerners and people who are not even necessarily pro Russia, but just skeptical of our involvement in this war in the first place. That this might be the direction things are going, that they are going to try to escalate this war to unprecedented levels, that they're going to try to and turn this into an absolute bloodbath, even if that does mean the laying down of Western lives. Now, I'm very hard pressed to believe that because as we've gone into before, there are only a handful of NATO countries that are, at least in the abstract, theoretically speaking, capable of raising an army capable of waging a war. And at that point, I would say what we're dealing with in terms of countries that actually have the force and the at least theoretical capability to sustain a war effort is the United States, Turkey, France, Poland, and I don't know, maybe Finland. I know that they, in terms of arms stockpiles, I do think they have a little bit more. And like I said, maybe there's a few other countries, but Germany couldn't, the UK couldn't, Spain couldn't, Italy couldn't, and we're just talking about major players. That's not even getting into the weasel countries within NATO that that would have certainly would not have the ability to raise their own army in order to fight a sustained war effort. That's just simply not happening. But it does make you wonder how far they're going to push this. Because once again, NATO has had several opportunities to fabricate a reason for intervention.
Oh yeah.
There are a number of different incidences that they could have run with at this point. Just the missiles that landed in Poland that turned out to be Ukrainian, the quote unquote violations of Romanian airspace, the missiles that allegedly landed in Romania, the entire issue with Transnistria, which we'll actually get into in a few minutes here with
Hmm.
the question of their accession into Russia and the request of the Transnistrian government. But there's been uh, the Baltic corridor, the corridor to Kaliningrad. The Lithuanians could have shut that off at any point and triggered that crisis. But point being is, if NATO wanted a reason to get involved in this war, if they wanted a reason to uh, escalate this, and mind you, what Macron had said, it was very, I'm sure it'll shock you, very much weasel words on his part that NATO countries should agree to send troops to Ukraine on a bilateral basis where they send them outside of their capacity as part of NATO, where France sends troops to help Ukraine, the United States sends troops to help Ukraine, Poland sends troops to help Ukraine, but it it creates the deniability that once they are casualties, it won't trigger Article 5, even though you know damn well if they really want to, they could use
Yeah.
that to trigger Article 5 at any point. And like I said, they've had plenty of opportunities where they, if they wanted to, they could have fabricated a situation in order to even just quote unquote send the troops on a bilateral basis. And the fact that they keep kicking the can down the road shows that A, they don't want to, B, they're incapable of doing so, or C, a combination of the aforementioned two, where it's just simply not going to happen for, like I said, either one or both of those reasons. And I lean on the side of both. I do think that there is apprehension about getting involved because they know they can't sustain that effort. And I wouldn't say that's the only reason, but that is certainly one of the main reasons. The fact that they know they're in no position to fight a war. I mean, you even have that the U.S. actually cut back, I believe it was in the U.S. Army, cut back numbers by 21,000. It cut back its goal by 21,000 in order to cope with the lack of recruitment. So they're cutting back on their mission, they're cutting back on their capacity, they're shrinking size in the U.S. Army in order to make up for the lack of manpower, the manpower that is not coming in at this time. So you have what is effectively a downsizing of the largest military, the most capable military in NATO, and you expect me to believe that NATO countries are preparing to send bilateral
Mm.
expeditionary forces in to fight Ukraine. It's the work of fantasy, and like I said, when Poland and Finland aren't willing to do that, when the countries that are supposed to be the spearhead against Russia are not willing to do so, Romania once again is another one of those countries, then it's simply not happening. I mean, the situation I did want to get a little bit into this, not too much, but a little bit into this. The situation between Poland and Ukraine has deteriorated to the point where the Polish government is now considering closing down the border completely between Poland and Ukraine. And I'm not sure whether that would include military shipments. I doubt it. I'm sure they would have some loophole for that. But in terms of the situation with particularly the grain and the migration, the amount of Ukrainians in Poland, there was consideration by Donald Tusk's government to shut down the border between Poland and Ukraine to the point where the EU, which is having every bit of juice squeezed out of it in order to sustain this war effort, even then, even their controlled opposition, well, not controlled opposition, but even their puppet elites, the ones that are answered to Brussels and ultimately to Washington, have had to look at the situation, reevaluate, and realize that, yeah, we understand our mission, we understand what we have to do here, but in order to just, for the sake of maintaining stability, for the sake of even existing in the future, we have to curtail these operations because they've simply become unsustainable otherwise. That is how much out of hand this situation has gotten with Europe in particular. And if I would say at any point since 2014, and especially since the start of this war, Europe has never been less prepared to involve itself in
Yeah.
a large scale conflict.
Yeah, I mean, they can also just leave Ukraine as a cautionary tale, right? Like something that keeps Europe frightened for decades, whilst America is busy doing something else somewhere else. And because I mean, essentially, America got a lot of what it wanted just in the first year. It broke Europe from Russia, so now it didn't have to worry about this continent being prosperous, and of course, prosperity will breed independence, just look at China.
Now, mind you, when it comes to that, I'm glad you brought that up, and I just want to expand on that. The question was never that Europe was ever going to break from the United States. Just the idea that Europe would have multiple avenues of income. The fact that they
Yes.
would still be a partner. They would still be a very strong, very much the Atlanticist system would still be in line, but they would
Hmm.
just have revenues coming from the east, coming from Russia. And once again, Europe still has a very robust trade relationship with the Chinese. It was just the fear that it, they wouldn't that Brussels wouldn't be directly subservient to Washington. Now, yes, you can point out examples of when the Europeans are defiant even now, but compare European defiance, just say in 2003, 2002, 2003, at the
Hmm.
outbreak of the Iraq War, compare it to 2022 at the outbreak of the Ukraine War. It's a night and day difference. And like you said, they had smashed this continent. They had smashed any sort of independent spirit. Not the fact that they risked losing any sort of alliance or partnership with the Europeans, just the fact that they wouldn't be the exclusive partners of the Europeans.
Right, right. It was a certain amount of independence that America could not tolerate, right? At the end of the day, America proved that it did not fully trust Europe, and it needed Ukraine as a way to bring Europe down, but bring Europe also closer to itself. Now, the danger is, where is this war going? You know, which set of elites in the US are going to win out? Because there won't be any European elites. They just don't matter. They are truly vassals of America, right? So I think Europeans gather by now that they are going to have to subsidize Ukraine for a long time. And you can look at what Macron said as a kind of panic, you know. Um, he's obviously just a representative for France. And he's going to be in there for another 3 years. So, the danger is, of course, if the set of elites in the US decides that the best thing to do is to send in the troops. And I think if that's the case, then it will probably happen before June. Because from the looks of it, uh, you know, in that excruciating detail with the maps and everything, um, the suggestion is that Russia is moving faster than it has since, the early weeks and months of 2022. We haven't seen this level of exchange of territory in Russia's favor for a year, at least, more than a year. And that's creating a kind of panic. The Ukrainians are in a panic themselves. There are stories about ammunition running out by April, early April at that. Um, it will be interesting to see what happens. I'm sure there are those who think if they go into Western Ukraine, Russia's not going to do anything. Nothing will happen. They believe that Russia is bluffing, right? So, we'll see. Because you have to understand that a lot of the population there now who might have been sympathetic to Russia has been completely intimidated, right? Like, take a look, for instance, Yanukovych's first election, which unconstitutionally they made him do another election, three elections or something, until what's her name,
Timoshenko.
Timoshenko got um, his position. So, um,
Wait, no, not Timoshenko. What's his
yes,
Yushchenko?
yeah, Yushchenko. But so that was in 2004. Now, Joaquin Flores believes that there was election rigging. right? Like the people who live there don't necessarily like they don't have pictures of Putin. They don't speak Russian. They don't have Russian flags at home. They consider themselves Ukrainians, but they just believe that they should have good relations with Russia as well, right? And when you look at the attacks on all the Orthodox churches, even out there, right? These are Orthodox churches that give, the last rites and a proper Christian burial to a lot of those men who are being buried, right? Um, and a lot of them, yes, they believe, maybe essentially or something close to what Putin was talking about how this people is divided into three separate groups and they should remain as such, blah blah blah. But if you look at the amount of attacks that have happened and this fake Ukrainian Orthodox Church that the Americans, with the help of Pompeo and the Patriarch of Constantinople, helped create, um, the part of the reason they're doing that is because there was probably still a sizable support, not the majority, but a sizable support of people who did not want Ukraine to go, let's say, the path that it's gone on now, even excluding the war, but just a path of total hostility to Russians. So, taking away the right to speak the Russian language, removing artifacts connected to Russian history, and having basically all kinds of these, you know,
Or the extremely schizophrenic view of claiming all these Russian historical figures as Ukrainian, while at the
yeah,
same time changing streets named after them and tearing down their statues.
yes, yeah.
That's
So
probably yeah.
crazy
That's
stuff like that. But sorry, I've
no. I'm glad you went on that, but that's I don't really think I can add much more to what you had said there, and I think you would really summarized what happened there. I suppose with all that being said, we can just for the last 20 minutes, last half hour of the show here, close out with some of the Middle Eastern news, just to update on the
yeah,
situation in Israel, Palestine, and the situation in Yemen as well. I think we should start with the incident that happened in the Red Sea that we did touch on
yeah,
earlier, with the Germans shooting down the Reaper drone, as I had said before, the revenge for Nord Stream. But
yeah. That
this,
Schultz.
I mean, I want to just take a step back and look at the past, I don't know, 2.5, 3 months of this, where you've had the Houthis create an effective blockade on the Red Sea. At this point, they've actually been able to sink ships with their missile launches. The fact that Russian ships, Chinese ships, and pretty much any ship that isn't associated with either the US, EU, or NATO has been given.
Or Israel.
Oh yeah, of course, has been allowed to pass through unimpeded. In fact, I don't know. Have they even been harassing, say, for example, like Japanese ships and Japanese very close to them?
I don't
And
know.
as far as I know, no. That they've just left East Asian shipping through the canal alone. And you have the American operation, the Coalition of the Willing 3. What are we, 3.0, 4.0 with that? I don't even remember at this point. Where the Americans send their ships, most of the European NATO partners who agree to this back out. Uh, Denmark sends an admiral. I believe it was Denmark that sent the admiral in order to advise the situation. The admiral with no ship, no fleet at all. And apparently, there were enough German forces on patrol to shoot down this Reaper drone, but we've been conducting strikes against Yemen since I believe mid-January, so about 6 weeks now, and we still have not dislodged the Houthis. And anyone who has paid attention to the situation in Yemen for the past just a few years, even I don't know, just past 5 or 6 years would realize that, of course, this was never going to happen because after a decade of Saudi and just Gulf state intervention in Yemen, with the coordination, with the funding and the backing of the United States and the West, who coordinated this war effort for Saudi Arabia, or else the Saudi military just could not function. I'm sure anyone who knows anything about the way the Gulf states operate that if it were not for the Western advisors, these militaries would not be conducting any operations. But even under the watchful eye of American, British, etc. advisors in this war in Yemen, they have not been able to dislodge the Houthis since 2015, since the outbreak of the war in Yemen. The Saudis at a certain point has resorted to, I guess, what could be considered a terror bombing campaign. That still didn't dislodge the Houthis. They, and then we reach the current situation where you have a more direct American intervention against the Houthis, against Yemen, in order to try to open up the Suez Canal and the Red Sea for trade. And it turns out what hasn't worked for almost 10 years under the advisory of American forces in cooperation with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the other Gulf states. I mean, mind you, the UAE has already given up on this war effort. Saudi Arabia, more or less, has entered into a soft ceasefire given their uh, attempts at reconciliation with the Iranians. The Saudi Saudi actions in Yemen have been greatly decreased just over the past couple years here. We still have not dislodged the blockade of the Red Sea, and frankly, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but it is one of these efforts that the U.S. has gotten itself into where, in order to maintain some degree of legitimacy, they have to make it look like they're trying to do something against the Red Sea, so they're just going to keep on pounding empty desert Yemen. They're going to keep on pounding, I don't know, maybe a village or two that had some ammunition stockpiles in order to make it look like we've had some sort of success. But barring an on the ground operation that actually goes through and involves engaging these people with a boots on the ground military force, that those red boots on the ground that no American politician aside from the late John McCain ever wants to touch the issue of, we're simply not clearing out the blockade of the Red Sea in Yemen. I know I've repeated this point a million times. I know a lot of other people have made this point as well. But it is one of those things that bears repeating, that in all of this, with all of this, in the wider Middle East, with the tensions with Iran, this is the end result, this complete stalemate. Look, of course, this wasn't going to result in any sort of mass casualties of the U.S., even with the Iranian and the Iranian aligned harassment of American presence in the region. They weren't going to ever end up causing great damage to the U.S., but what they are causing the U.S. is, in terms of America's position in the world, almost as bad, is costing it legitimacy, costing it, its appearance, its optics. The longer this
Hmm.
goes on, the more impotent the American empire looks, the less capable of a force, especially for global stability, that it looks like. And like, needless to say, combined with the collapse of Afghanistan, the situation in Ukraine, the situation in East Asia that could flare up at any moment, that was certainly on the way out as it is. And this is really just the latest in a series of events that just continue to call America's legitimacy into question as a hegemonic force worldwide. And I do have to wonder, how much longer can this go on before confidence breaks down? I know we were just talking about the fact that the Americans, they have Europe completely under their thumb, so that's not going anywhere. But in terms of these other countries that rely on the American protected sea routes, when are they going to start to look to other protections? Especially considering the fact that, once again, we're still getting ships from several different nations that can pass through unimpeded. That Chinese ships aren't harassed, Russian ships aren't harassed, the Iranian ships aren't harassed. Pretty much anyone who isn't the U.S., European country, or Israel are allowed to use the Red Sea as if there were no blockade. Even the
Hmm.
Arab countries that have been, let's just say, lax on the Palestinian issue, such as some may say Egypt. And I know Egypt controls the Suez Canal, so there's a bit of something there that could be an exception. But once again, their trade vessels are not harassed. And at what point do the insurance companies seriously look at their own bottom line and say, this simply isn't worth it? And I know you can point to a lot of the traffic that has been diverted around the Horn of Africa as of late, and the numbers ticked up by, don't quote me on this, I could be wrong, but I believe something like 4 times the end of since November of 2023. The amount of vessels traversing the Horn of Africa has gone up by about 4 times. So once again, trade is still happening. There are other trade routes, but that is a major diversion. And especially when we get into the question of icebreakers as technology develops, as the climate, as some say, is changing up north, as those sea lanes become more passable in the Arctic, that opens up yet another alternative route, something that where the Americans have a presence in the Arctic, especially in conjunction with the Canadians, but in terms of the people who've been investing in icebreakers, have been investing in ships that can traverse those waters, it's been Russia, it's been China, and just talking broader about trade routes, it's an area of sea that is not completely under the thumb of the American Navy. And as those routes open up, as technology advances, the climate changes, the Americans are not leading the way on that. As say they
Hmm.
maybe would have in a different time, say 4 or 5 decades ago, and they would have, if there were some major shift like that, they would have been on the forefront of that. They would have been in competition with that. Of course, they would have had to contend with the Soviet Union. Whatever point being is, they would have been making an effort. As far as I know, there's no American effort to look into these new routes. And like I said, we have a major Arctic coast, Alaska. We are so integrated with the Canadians that their Arctic coast is effectively ours as well, and we should be in close cooperation on that. One would think we'd be in close cooperation on that issue, but it doesn't seem like anyone is really even willing to touch that. And I know I started off by talking about Yemen, but I do think that this entire crisis, when you take a look at this, when you zoom out, it calls into question the entire sea trade network that is supposedly guaranteed by the Americans. How viable is that? And especially as it loses legitimacy more and more every day. Sure, like I said, most countries might be unaffected by this Yemen crisis, but let's say there's some crisis that doesn't discriminate against nations. Let's say there's, I don't know, resurgence in Somali pirates, as unlikely that is. They're likely not going to take the time to differentiate between U.S., Chinese, Russian, European, etc. ships. They're just looking to seize vessels. And at that point, when you have an American Navy that's incapable of enforcing its, you sent me the map here. I'll just pull
Hmm.
this up just for reference. Uh, but when you have an American Navy that's incapable of enforcing these guarantees it's made to the rest of the world, at what point does the world start to look at this and just question how viable is it for this country that has promised us safe passage through the seas worldwide? How reliable are they on delivering that promise if they can't deliver at one of the most vital trade routes in the world?
Yeah, it's a big deal. Yeah, I don't I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do, but I mean, what I'm afraid of is is a major escalation in the Middle East because today, as you know, the Israelis have been bombing not only Lebanon but Syria for a long time, and from time to time they'll take out some of the factions that are connected with Iran, but not necessarily Hezbollah, because there are well more than just one or two resistance groups. And they'll take out three or four guys, and one or two of them is a major commander, and so on. That's been going on for quite some time. But today, The Israelis began bombing the outskirts of, I believe, Damascus, and then they dropped one of their bombs, just as they've been doing in Palestine. This is a major, major, major escalation. And in many ways, I see this as a kind of Israel is trying to do what Ukraine was told to do, essentially, was to provoke Russia. And they are there to provoke Lebanon and Syria to do something more than they are doing, right? And then that would give America the pretext and a kind of fog of war that let's say they have to intervene. You know, Israelis died, y'all. Um, but it could be let's say the tripwire for I don't know America getting more involved in Syria. Now, as you rightly pointed out much earlier in the show, um, America's military has had to be downscaled. So, how are they going to retaliate? How are they going to rectify the situation? Because in many ways, America, I think, was playing a long game in Syria, where they like the sanctions would have crippled them. Like eventually, the people would just after 15, 20 years, they just can't take it anymore, right? And they succumb. Or they would just turn it into a Lebanon, right? They would like Russians not to be there, but that's, I think, what the long range plan was. Of course, you're always hoping for other events to take place that are indeterminable. And some are, but we don't know what those events would be. But um, the Yemen case is peculiar to me. um, because just the level of payback, right, um, is quite something. A lot of people, for instance, speculate that that British ship that the Houthis knocked down, the Brits are not being absolutely forthcoming about how that happened. But some people have speculated that the Russians supplied those missiles to the Houthis as payback for the various attacks that the British have managed to coordinate with the Ukrainians, and even attacks that are outside of Ukraine, or the parts of Ukraine that have been incorporated into Russia from the after the onset of the SMO. So I don't know. I don't know, but China, for instance, is building uh, huge amounts of uh, MLRS systems and rocket launch systems. These are not mobile, some of them that I'm talking about, but not all of them. Um, I don't know. I don't know what is America's plan. If they still want to rectify the situation, then they have to go, like, they have to really, really escalate. Now, if we speculate that they haven't been completely forthcoming about the amount of armaments and ammunition that they have, and this is why, for instance, Ukraine can't have it, well, then, all bets are off.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that I actually was reminded of this, so I'm going to bring this up in conjunction with what you had just said. Did you see the Israeli UN ambassador's speech about Russia?
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
And this echoes actually what that one Likud party member, I can't remember his name, had
Oh, yeah, he
said
freaked
on
out.
RT, where
We
he,
will destroy Russia for
yeah,
this.
where he completely lost it. But the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, gave a speech at the UN, and this was the special assembly that they had in regard to the 2 year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and said that Israel is committed to providing early warning system against missile to Ukraine and referring to Ukraine as an ally, comparing Russia to Hamas, of course, saying that Israel knows what it's like to be under attack and have missiles launched at civilians, and just all the regular bloviating that you would
Yeah.
expect. But mind you, this is under Netanyahu's government, and Netanyahu spent years cultivating at least a working relationship with Putin and Russia. From when was his second term as prime minister? But 2011 to
Mm.
2019,
Yeah,
2020.
something like that.
Uh, most of the
He was
20
there during COVID,
yeah most of the
at
20
least the first
teens.
year of COVID.
Yeah, but it was during that pivotal time when Russia was really starting to reassert itself. We saw Crimea, we saw the intervention in Syria, where Netanyahu was constantly going to Moscow, constantly meeting with Putin, and keeping relations between the two at least on workable terms. But now you have the UN ambassador, which I believe, much like in the U.S., it is a position appointed by the head of the Israeli government, where the that is one of Netanyahu's appointees, flies out to New York to give this speech that is reiterating commitment to Ukraine, speaking clearly on behalf of the Netanyahu government, with the pledge of missile systems to Ukraine. Now, as far as I know, I haven't seen any major. Now, I know that Bennett and whatever that other caretaker prime minister's name was really went hard against the Russians in terms of Ukraine and the question of the invasion. But I know Netanyahu has been a bit more tempered on the issue. He hasn't really addressed the issue.
You thinking Bennett?
Yeah, Bennett, and I'm there was some other one that had that was also in office for a short amount of time. Not that.
Gallant?
Yes, yes. But with that, you notice that Netanyahu has been quiet about this entire thing, about the whole entire Russia-Ukraine thing, and has not touched the issue. And
Yeah.
it does make you wonder about the relationship that does exist between the U.S. and Israel. Now, I know you can point to the vast amounts of Israeli influence within the U.S. government. That's certainly, I'm not going to deny any of that. And that when it comes to a number of different issues, particularly American foreign policy in the Middle East, that they lead America around, that they have America in its grasp. Okay, that's undeniable. But when it comes to the larger issues, especially now that the situation with Russia has grown sour to such a point where we are where we're at, especially with the Ukraine war, it does make you wonder, especially with the contentious relationship between Biden and Netanyahu, how much of the American influence in Israel has been leveraged in order to have the Israelis distance themselves from the Russians
Mhm.
and have
Well,
Netanyahu.
we should remember, like, it's not just a question of Hamas goes to Moscow, which I don't see what is the problem if Hamas goes to Moscow. Like, I mean, I really don't give a shit if Israelis think they're terrorists. Like, um, Israelis can go to Moscow and so can Hamas. What is the big deal? Um, um, I'm in agreement with the Russians that no, Israel does not have a right to defend itself on land that it's occupying. That is what Russia's representative to the UN said months ago, right? Putin in January said that, do you realize that there are operations being performed on children under 5 without anesthetic, right? Israel deserves that kind of criticism. It deserves it. It's earned it. I mean, honestly, to
Oh,
hell with them.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm the. It's you're not going to find any disagreement from me when it comes to any of that. But uh, you you do have to wonder, though, with the shift in Russian-Israeli relations, how much of that is just the duplicitousness and the just general temperament of the Israelis versus how much of that came from Washington pulling the leash on Israel. Because, like I said, you can talk about the Israeli influence in Washington, which like I said, I'm not going to deny at all. But there is some pull the other direction, not nearly as much, but there is some pull. And like I said, I just think that these comments, on top of the normal bloviating, are an interesting shift when it comes to the out and out support for Ukraine that you didn't really hear except from that one unhinged Likud member on RT.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think it could be a combination of things. One of them is that Israel feels more and more threatened. There was a major attack by Hezbollah that knocked out some kind of refinery, a huge fire in northern Israel. Remember, tens of thousands of people have left there in America and America, same thing. Um, they tend to think that if they lose their settlers, they lose their legitimacy. Not untrue. And they're very upset about how many settlers have left. There's about 1 million Israelis that are kind of refugees in their own country as a result of this war. So it could be that, and it could be aligning with some American interests to um, maybe pressure Russia in Syria to divide its attention. Um, it would maybe offer some relief. Uh, Maybe that's what they're speculating for the Ukrainians. Um, it's it's hard to say, but it could also be that the Israelis are frustrated at some of the remarks that the Russians have made at the UN, and that they're basically in solidarity with with the Arab world. It's not a position that Israel enjoys being in, but it's a position with regards to Russia and previously the Soviet Union. It has had uh, accept. So at the moment, I'm not exactly certain which. I mean, honestly, it could be all those three things.
Yeah, I would agree. And I suppose just the last topic I would like to close out with is just an update out of Armenia and the deteriorating situation there. And that is, in the past week, Nicole Pashinyan, who I will once again say, in my opinion, is the greatest living traitor to his nation, and that's a very high bar these days. But I still think Pashinyan takes the gold for that one. Has suspended cooperation with the CTSO, which is the Russian-led security pact of a number of former Soviet states, and he has turned to France in order to seek protection. And this is all the while Azerbaijan is saying that it needs to prepare itself for a larger military operation against Armenia because Azerbaijan is still after the quest for its corridor to its exclave to the west of Armenia. Because if you look at the map, you have Armenia, you have Azerbaijan proper to the east, and you have the exclave to the west. And it's speculated, and I suppose we'll see what actually happens because the question of Karabakh, of Nagorno Karabakh, was much different because that was an ethnic enclave of Armenians within Azerbaijan. So when the Armenians refused to defend that and the quote unquote agreements were reached, the Armenians of Nagorno Karabakh were expelled.
Hmm.
And of course, Pashinyan was reluctant to take them in because he knew that these people would not support him because he's the number one person who let them down more than the Russians, more than the West, more than the Iranians. Like I said, you can point fingers at all of them all day, all of Armenia and Nagorno Karabakh's foreign sponsors. But at the end of the day, the blame does fall on Pashinyan for failing to intervene on behalf of these people. And so we're talking tens of thousands of people that he more or less kept in a state of limbo before allowing into Armenia proper. A lot of these people have just ended up going abroad because it has been an easier path than trying to get into Armenia. You now have the Azeris, and once again, that just could be hot air. Mind you, the Azeris are very intimate with Israel, especially when it comes to the drone program. A lot of people don't like to touch that issue. A lot of people don't know about that issue, but that is the
And I don't
case.
know if he lives. His wife is Jewish.
Oh, really? I actually
Yeah,
didn't.
I have heard that she's Jewish. So
I don't disbelieve it, but I actually have not heard that one before. And that doesn't
does
surprise
seem
me.
odd. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not. I'm just saying that's
And
something I've
I
heard.
will just say on that note, mind you, Azerbaijan is a very nominally Muslim country. The people there aren't exactly the most fervent of Muslims that you might find in the Gulf
Yeah.
or Iran, for example. But they are very ethnically charged, especially on the issue of Armenia. They do, and they are Turkey people, so they do view themselves as close to Turkey for that obvious reason. They're very similar people. But it, it does, if we're to take the bluster of the Azeris at face value, it does look like a very dire situation for the people of Armenia. Armenia proper this time. Not even talking about
Hmm.
Artsakh, not even talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, the ethnic enclave that was sold out by Pashinyan. And the question is, will Pashinyan continue the trend of selling out his own nation in its entirety? And his suspension of cooperation with the CSTO would suggest that yes, that is the case. And I know some may say that Armenia shouldn't be beholden to Russia. They have no obligation to be beholden to Russia. Whatever, whatever. I don't care about that point. That's not the point I'm trying to make right now. But then, okay, yeah, they want to reach out to the French. They want to reach out to the West, diversify their security options. That's one thing. But when you're deliberately closing avenues, especially with a country that is treaty bound to defend your proper territory, and you can say they didn't do enough for the situation
He
in
didn't even
Nagorno-Karabakh.
recognize the territory as
Exactly.
being.
According to Pashinyan, according to his direction of the Armenian government, they recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan, which led to this crisis in the first place, leaving no recourse for any outside powers that would have otherwise intervened to their assistance. He had every
He's
opportunity.
like literally saying, don't help them."
That was the case, and like I said, anyone who wants to lay the blame at anyone's feet except Nicole Pashinyan simply does not have a full
Yeah.
grasp on the situation. And he continues to do this, and at this time, he's threatening the, the security and sovereignty of Armenia proper. And while I don't think the Azeris will do anything because, like I said, the situation with an ethnic enclave within another country versus two sovereign states are two very different situations. I think these areas are mostly just blowing hot air right now. I could be proven wrong.
Hmm.
I hope I'm right about this, but like I said, it's very well that this could escalate into something else. Do we believe that this man is not going to cede more territory this time of Armenia proper? And if he does, what are the ramifications of that? And I do think I know I've said this before when bringing up the issue. This man has the potential to destroy Armenia as an officially independent state. Now
I
I know a
know.
country that size can never really be independent, but he does have the potential to see Armenia erased from the map for another century at least if he wants to. And some might say that's dramatic, but with the effort this man has shown and the fact that he has still not been removed from power. Now I know that there were very fervent protests against him. I know that there were murmurs within the Armenian military against him, but none of those ever materialized. But the question is, if he were to, let's say, worst case scenario, cede the corridor, would he be able to maintain his grasp on power? I would like to say no. I'd like
Mm.
to say that either somebody within the Armenian military or the people or somebody within the Armenian political class would dispose of him. But given the track record, I don't think that's the case, and I'm not even saying that as a discredit to the Armenian people because, like I said, they did very harshly protest against him. And we'll see what happens in the next election if he is somehow removed from power. Not that I put too much faith in the democratic system, But I hate to say it, the only
Mm.
way see the situation ending is Armenia coming out on the losing end, no matter what happens.
Yeah, I don't see the point. I mean, he was sponsored by George Soros for his presidency, and of course the U.S. Same thing. And I mean, I presume he wants to be part of the EU. He wants to be part of NATO. What part is going to be in that if things keep going like this?
The diaspora.
I don't understand. The diaspora. That's right. All those Armenians in France are already in NATO and EU, dum dum.
But those Armenians in Russia, they need to be liberated.
Yeah, yes,
All
they
the way up to
certainly do.
Lavrov.
Yes. Yeah,
All the way up. But I mean, in all seriousness, that's really what it becomes. I think the Armenians are already one of those countries where the diaspora is multiple times larger than the actual population of the nation itself. And
yeah,
I mean, at the end of the day, what does Pashinyan care? Because he'll get the golden parachute. He'll get to live in exile in Europe or the United States or wherever when all of this comes crashing down. He has the means to get out of this and to screw over his people more. And like I said, I genuinely do hope that there is some sort of swift and sudden regime change in Armenia that is willing to actually defend the interests of its nation and not forsake every foreign partner it has and actually stand up for itself and uh, act as you think a proper Armenian nation should. But I can't say I'm optimistic about this. I can't say
mm,
that I see much hope for Armenia's future. And uh, like I said, I take no pleasure in this, but I think they're screwed, and that their future for the next if century at least is just going to be that of a diaspora people. And uh, ironically enough, their two largest diasporas are the United States and Russia. And you actually listen to diaspora in the U.S. and Russia speak, it's a night and day difference. They're
oh yeah.
completely different people with very different worldviews. Um, I mean, you want an example of what American Armenian diaspora looks like? Look at Glendale, California. That should tell you everything you need to know. Whereas,
Hmm.
to my understanding, the ones in Russia are quite. I don't like the term conservative or right wing in outside the context of the West, but they're very different temperament of people in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
part. And
So I mean, I know personally um, a gymnastics coach who is Armenian from Russia, Armenian descent from Russia, and also Ukraine. So yeah, I can, and I know another Armenian who, of course, was born in Syria, lived for a large chunk of his childhood in Lebanon, and then in his teenage years, his family moved to Canada, which is ostensibly the same thing. I mean, let's be honest. In many ways, like it's just a dumb satellite state. I'm being awfully frank tonight.
so true. But like I said, there's not much more I can say without
Yeah.
falling into the trap of repeating myself. But uh, like I said, I hope I'm wrong about what I'm saying here. I hope the Armenians have some sort of national breakthrough that really puts this situation to rest. And I would love to see the Azeris taken down a peg or two. I just they're
Well, the
very
apparent logic of it or the illogic of it is so crazy, right? Like I said, I thought you wanted to be part of the EU. What part is going to be in the EU? Um, I mean, obviously, it has to be like to some extent a viable state. Is America like in a position now where they can fund Armenia? Like, is there some bigger game at play? Like, I just don't know. Like, is he working on an ultimate partnership with Azerbaijan and Armenia? like some kind of integration that keeps Russia out, you know.
And mind you, this is
Uh,
the same European Union that imports how much gas from Azerbaijan?
oh, who?
Uh, the European Union imports how much gas from
Yes. I,
Azerbaijan?
I don't know
It's
exactly the amount, but they now rely on them more than ever before. So, and Russia owns something like 20% of all um, Azerbaijani exports. So,
it, like there's only so many ways we can say it. It's really just a no-win situation that they put themselves in, and I suppose what you've said makes sense. Just keep offering appeasements to the Azeris, smooth that situation over, and then have some sort of united front against Russia in the Caucasus, in combination, I guess, with Georgia at that point, and minus Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Just write those off, and you just have some amalgamation, like Franken-state federation of these Caucasus. What was it? The Transcaucasian Soviet Republic minus the Russians. That just this. It really is a grotesque Soviet creation that it does seem like Pashinyan has in mind of these three Caucasian states, and I guess they're. I guess after that, then they can appendage themselves in the European Union and be part of the quote unquote free world. Is that
honestly, that's the only thing. That's the only thing I see happening. Is there has to be some kind of an agreement with the Azeris in the background. He has to pretend like he kind of wants to defend Armenia, right? Like now, the latest is, of course, that France is going to supply him with, I don't know, like 10 stupid infantry fighting vehicles that are not even that great. Like that's
how
going to hold
selfish
back
of
the
Armenia?
Azeris.
Ukraine needs those infantry fighting vehicles far more than the Armenians do.
They're not even Europeans like us.
Yeah, I've seen the size of their noses.
God, you're terrible. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I don't know. Like the only thing I can think of where let's say Armenia doesn't get completely like because you have to ask yourself, how can America sort of like just not do anything? Now, I'm not suggesting that America should do something necessarily, right? But it is a change in the order, right? We do have a very big Armenian population that is generally not sympathetic to Russia, right? Like obviously now everybody understands it's between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Russia's not playing a role in it. I just, I'm kind of like at a loss for words. Like, do they want this to happen? That's why I bring up. Is there a possibility that there is going to be some kind of a union that is going to form, let's say informally, and Armenia gets paid off, they get some kind of money for it, and that's that. It's just hard for me to fathom that they would lose ev- everything or almost everything and have nothing in return. It just there's a part of me that just can't accept that. So there must be something else at play.
I would say that's probably the most plausible explanation I've heard for all of this. The fact that they want to form some sort of warped, like Soviet style ethnic federation of maybe
Some kind of
like I
South
said,
Caucasus thing,
yeah,
like
maybe not
a bearing of
officially,
the hatchet with the Armenians
yeah.
and the Turks. There's no way the Kurds are going to be part of that.
Oh, of course not. But yeah, as soon as they can either sway Erdogan or knock him out of power, then they can have that connection right to the Caucasus and have Russia hemmed in on yet another front.
Yeah,
Like I said, and even just to touch on the point of Erdogan in Turkey, while the situation is remarkably good right now, far better I think anyone could have expected for Russian-Turkish relations. There are a lot of threads that can come undone under Erdogan or not, just by the nature of those two countries and just where they are in the world and where they are geographically, civilization. Like I said, there's a lot of things that it it's a good relationship built on a very unstable foundation right now, I would say, and that
Hmm.
and that I would be remiss if it's not one of the top priorities of NATO, of the EU, of the West, in order to unravel that relationship. And I do think they've tried to multiple times,
Yes.
and I do think that they're going to continue to try to. And like I said, just given the amount of tension there, not that I think it will happen anytime soon. I do think it's an inevitability that Russian Turkish relations just fall through. Just on a side note, but um, just, I mean, but then there's a lot of consideration of just the state of the West and what could happen there and what would have to happen in both Turkey and Russia for that to come to fruition. But like I said, I think just getting back to your ultimate point that Pashinyan is banking on some sort of uh, loose connection of the European Union and NATO through the Caucasus in order to somehow include both Armenia and Azerbaijan, with how just ridiculously conciliatory he's been towards the Azeris. And like I said, Georgia has just been completely forgotten by everyone. It's
Yeah,
so
it
irrelevant these
really
days.
has.
Just
No, but
2008 came and went.
Georgia's very much playing ball with Russia. They're not introducing sanctions. A lot of the disruption. Remember, like Ukraine was trying to convince Georgia to start a war. Like I know people have forgotten about it, obviously, right? But that was one of the things that they had in mind um, in order to divert Russia's, either success or maintaining the territory that they captured in the Ukraine.
Not to mention
So
the just massive number of Russians who had fled to Georgia just over the years,
yes,
and especially the spike that happened with the war, and a lot of them still return home regularly. And there's flights from
yeah,
major Georgian airports to major Russian airports, and the fact that while there might be the political tensions, economic relations continue unimpeded between the two, it's actually been quite remarkable.
yeah. I mean, the best way to guess is you have to sort of understand that um, obviously, whatever is happening in Armenia and Azerbaijan, if you just forget for a second, like questions of American incompetence, that ultimately what they want is whatever happens there, it's a net negative for Russia, whatever the cost to Armenia that might be, right? But it would be a bonus if Armenia could be brought. You can see the efforts by the Americans to bring Armenia on side with the West.
How long until America has to finally cave on its wishy-washy position and actually recognize the Armenian genocide in order to make that happen? Because mind you, that like I said, we've been very wishy-washy on that issue, particularly with our relations with Turkey, where we just haven't touched it. And now it's funny because there's individual U.S. states who have done it, but the federal government has just not taken a position. They haven't outright denied it either. And there's a few countries that have, but in terms of countries that actually haven't recognized it, and like I said, you can only place so much on the historic tensions. But I mean, just given the political situation of Armenia, the nation of Armenia, and where it is today, I would say, and this might be a controversial opinion, that the Armenian genocide actually does carry a lot more modern political relevance than, let's just say, a certain event of the 20th, mid 20th century that affected the Jewish people. Does I mean, look, yeah, I get narrative rhetoric that they like to bring it up, but in terms of like real, like materialized effects on nations and people, I would say actually, when it comes to the question of the Armenian genocide, it actually does carry a lot more real weight versus rhetorical weight. But that's just an aside. Yeah, just in terms of the way that the situation's shaken out with diaspora, with the actual borders, with the history both within the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union. But just just to put a final word on the caucus before I wrap up this episode, like I don't think I can really say much more than they're clearly trying to form some sort of anti-Russia bulwark to varying degrees of success, and we'll really see what happens. I don't know. Maybe some miracle will come out of Armenia where some reverse color revolution will happen, and a lot of the damage will be undone, and they'll rectify their decision of the CSTO, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not holding my breath for that. Maybe
Mm,
it'll be some middle of the road where it's some Armenian government that tries to play both sides of this, or maybe Pashinyan, the color revolution regime, will continue until Armenia is a fragment of itself, both in terms of territory and in terms of national interest, in order for it to be a proper uh, puppet of the American Empire. Who knows? And there's a number of different possibilities, none of which are very good. And like I said, I'll just reiterate once more. I take no pleasure in saying this.
mhm.
I quite like Armenia as a nation. I have clearly nothing against them. And especially when it comes to former Soviet republics in terms of insufferable ones, they're not on that list. They're not
Yeah, yeah.
particularly on that list, at least in terms of the people in the nation. The diaspora is a different question. The diaspora is a very mixed bag, and it depends, like I said, on where you're talking about, which group, blah blah blah. But it's like I said, it's one of those situations that I really no winning move, and I hate to say it, but
Mhm.
I guess that's my final thoughts. If there's any last minute stories you want to bring up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I will bring up the immolation of that young man in front of the Israeli embassy. It is the second one that has happened, but it's interesting that this one got more press. Now, I know a lot of people are thinking like, well, it's not going to stay in the news that long, but I would say even if it doesn't, it's kind of like a harbinger. And the reason I say this is oh, I forget the name of it, but there was that documentary that came out, I think in 2000, 2001, 2002, about McNamara, how I think he was working for Ford, and then he started working for the White House. And there was I believe, a Quaker who immolated himself in 1965, and he happened to see it. He walked out the door outside, and he saw this man immolate himself. Now, the war went on for several years, and most people only think of the picture of the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire, but he did that because he felt Buddhists were getting treated like second class citizens in predominantly Catholic South Vietnam. So um, that is true. So that has to be specified, right? Um, but ultimately, um, Jews are thinking, you know, um, these even the left wing. Um, the left wing Antifa types, because apparently this guy had some involvement with Antifa. Um, and I think the New York Times ran an article that his family was a religious belonged to a religious Christian community in um, Cape Cod, of all places, right? I don't know if that was a way to bring dirt on him, but all I'm saying is this: like, from their point of view, they're looking at, like, now it could push the Israelis to do even more insane things, because this message is basically saying, white dudes don't want to die for you, and they can't, like, they're not like you, right? They're not like Israeli Jews. Like, what Israeli Jew would ever self-immolate for anybody but, like, maybe his own people? He would never do it for another people, right? So Europeans, Israelis, very different people, not the same people at all. And they have to be thinking why did you know, that this is a bad sign? Because of course, for them, you know, Iran is the big boogeyman that they have to get rid of, right? Israel can't sleep at night unless something is done for against Iran. And well, I mean, Israel is a country that can't survive without America, and it uses America. It's a parasite on America, and so you know, it's very sad that this man felt that he had to do that. Uh, you know, obviously, there's you know, there might have been some issues, but I don't think he was cowardly. Um, and of course, as Christians, you know, we condemn suicide. But pulling back a bit, I think it is interesting. I think it is a kind of a harbinger, right? Um, and you know, I don't think you know, for Biden's reelection, this is not a good sign either. Um, Not that that matters with Israel, because this is like the most Israeli. Like, if you thought Trump was Israeli cucked, wow. Be prepared for Biden. Um, it's just extraordinary. Even Bush Jr. and Obama could like come through and not give Israel aid in order to deter what it was doing. Biden simply is incapable. Um, he's just a cowardly, cowardly man. Um,
With no mental faculties these days either.
yeah. I mean, look at his staff, right? Blinken, so many of them. So, um, I don't know. You know,
My
I would say
stepfather
that.
was liberated by a black tank crew.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah,
It's
but
just
yeah, to get back to the kid who self-immolated, I think a lot of people are getting caught up on his political affiliations, which, like I said, it's not like I'm in agreement with this weird
yeah, yeah.
Antifa whatever nonsense, but I do think it does show a very interesting shift in terms of just U.S. political culture. Since I think, what was he, 21, 19,
25.
oh yeah, okay, so within that age range.
Yeah.
And it shows, like, clearly he wouldn't be sympathetic to, say, right wing ideas in any sense, but he is so disillusioned with the regime, even from a left wing standpoint, to the point where he decides he's going to end his own life in a political act in order to draw attention to this. Now, like I said, what the ramifications of this will be, that it will remain to be seen. Perhaps this. I'm not saying a bunch of other people will do what he did, but perhaps this is a larger trend in terms of um, public outrage towards this that really does spell an issue for someone like Biden in terms of his reelection. Where I'm not saying that these people are going to defect Trump, because certainly it's not like Trump is going to be
No, no, no. They're
anti-Israel
just
by
not
any
going to
means,
vote.
but it's going to breed apathy. It's going to create, yeah, people who stay home on election day.
Yeah.
But I do think it is strange, and not to speculate too much on this guy's personal situation, where we have had situations like this in the past, and you can think back to that one Manning guy who quote unquote transitioned, but before he did that and before he got arrested, he leaked massive amounts of documents, one of the largest leaks to WikiLeaks ever. And that, number one, I'm surprised that someone who was willing to do that didn't have some sort of leak planned, or didn't have some sort of way to expose information. I don't know, maybe just didn't have access to it. But point being is, in the coming years, I wouldn't be surprised as if as we continue to get people who are more disillusioned with the regime, whether it be from a left wing or right wing perspective, if we do see a uptick in leaking of government documents and government secrets from people like that. Like I said, maybe they won't do things quite as drastic as he did, but I do think that divorcing it just from this one individual person and looking at this as a potential broader trend, that I do think these very public acts of disillusionment, even if it's not this extreme, are
Yeah.
going to continue.
Yeah, it's part of the decline. It's part of the dystopia. Like, um, the other thing I thought of, right? I remember way back, it must have been like 2014, right? I was on Google Plus at the time, just as it was dying. Uh, and I remember there was a photo that was circulating of this West Point graduate, and he had taken his hat off. Right, he's wearing his military garb. He has taken his cap off, and in it is something like a note that he had written, something along the lines of "Communism will win." Like, and he's happy about it, right? I mean, like, I don't know what to say. Like, I know there's a lot of rightists, like, I mean, part of me doesn't care. I hate to say it. I literally don't. Um, Part of it is entertaining to see just like how all these efforts have backfired, right? And it's okay if it backfires. I mean, it's going to happen anyways. Um, I imagine there's a lot of leftists in the American military, and we've already talked about how many of them are non-white. So only 44% are white, and a lot of them that are joining, they're probably leftists. Uh,
I mean,
you know,
especially considering the degree they went to purge any sort of right wing ideas. This. I mean, that's just not surprising in the
Yeah,
slightest.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And Obama is mostly responsible for that. Like, on the other hand, right? I understand people's trepidation because how many times have we said on this show that it seems like the American military is there to keep order in the U.S. Right? These guys would probably play a role in that. Um, so I don't know. Like, um, I don't buy this other idea that the Palestinians will forget about him. White people will forget about him, yeah, of course, except for a few, activist types and stuff like that. But no, they won't. They won't. A lot of people in that region won't forget it. It's a big deal to them.
Yeah, they do cling on to a lot of that stuff, and yeah, you can point to the fact that BLM activists, for the scum that they are, like, oh, but he was a white people. I mean, of course they're going to do that because that's never their priority. Their priority is always themselves and their ethno-racial movement. And once again, everyone knows that, but
Yeah, yeah,
it, something else that it reminds me of in terms of just distance around that like same time period, around the time we were really getting involved in Syria, where it's like you had a lot of these like anonymous soldiers like who were like quoting the message like "I will not fight for Al Qaeda in Syria," that kind of stuff too. I'm sure you remember
yeah,
some of
yeah,
those.
yeah,
Like I said, I do think in as we had brought up, there's been just general purge of any sort of right wing sympathies from the military. You have a lot of these people who are of that more left wing mindset, but that's still, although while diametrically opposed to most everything I believe in, still does lend itself to anti regime sentiments just from a different
mhm,
perspective. Uh,
yeah,
it does make you wonder that as the situation deteriorates and whether the military be used for some sort of domestic control operation or some sort of foreign war, how effective a force it's going to be with those people staffing. And I don't know, perhaps you
yeah,
could
yeah,
argue from our perspective, it's a good thing if the U.S. military is less effective because it's certainly not serving our interests. So
yeah,
uh, the less effective it is, the better for us. But it does raise a lot of questions. And like I said, just divorcing yourself from the individual in this case and just looking at it from a broader perspective, I do think that in a way it has opened a floodgate, and it also has raised a number of questions that have certainly have yet to be resolved, and we'll see what really comes that, especially as tensions increase, especially as political polarization within the U.S. increase. I do think that this is like maybe not as extreme actions, but we're witnessing the beginning of what could generally be called a trend.
Yeah, and you know, like that first woman who immolated herself, she wrapped herself in a Palestinian flag. I can't recall whether she was Palestinian or not, um, but I think it happened in Florida or Georgia. I don't even recall it. See, that one just flew. This one didn't, and you know, the news cycle does move quickly, but I think. Like I say, I do think it's a harbinger. Nobody knows about the Quaker who immolated himself in 1865, but obviously over time it did have some kind of an effect. So I don't know. You know, um, ultimately, it is good that although extremely extreme, you know, you have an example. I mean, he doesn't even identify with white. Of course, he had all the typical shitlib statements on his social media about whiteness and whatever. But ultimately, that isn't how the Israelis see it, and that isn't how, you know, hawkish Jews in America see it either.
And I don't want to be morbid about a man's death, especially under such circumstances, but it does show cracks in the system. And
Yeah.
like I said, with an institution like the military, which once again has forsaken people like me, people like us, and on the other side of that, with the neoconservative crowd, with the particularly neoconservative Jewish crowd, and the other leftists who will debate this issue, the other liberals who will debate this issue. Ultimately, like I said, while this guy wasn't quote unquote on our side, the can of worms it opens. Like I said, I don't want to be morbid about a man's death, but in terms of what happened, just the political ramifications of this, if this does stick, and I don't know, it might. Uh, it just creates a jumbled mess uh,
For the regime.
for
Yeah.
the regime, for the worst people in this country. So, like I said, I'm not going to condone his actions, especially the fact that he did deliberately end his own life, and there's no denying that. And like I said, not to be too morbid about the situation, it does create a mess for the regime and for all the different constituent factions of the ruling class. In which case, I, I can't help but find that interesting in a way. The fact that this one thing, like I said, I don't know. Perhaps maybe this will be forgotten out, maybe not. But we'll generally have to see about that, and we'll
Hmm.
have to see what copycats come out of this, whether it's that extreme or people doing other acts of public resistance, or I don't know, maybe leaking documents. But like I said, I do think that potentially a floodgate has been opened in terms of acts of dissent, whether publicly or not, honestly.
Yeah. I think you summed it up really well.
But I guess that's all I had, unless you have anything else.
No, that's it.
So thank you everyone for tuning into this return episode, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care, guys.